The Necron homeworld existed as a monument to cruelty, a planet bathed in the merciless radiation of its dying star. This celestial body, bloated and unstable, bombarded the surface with waves of deadly energy that seeped into every living thing. The Necron who evolved in this hostile cradle developed as a species defined by suffering. Their flesh proved vulnerable to the stellar radiation, leading to cancers, mutations, and cellular degradation that made their lifespans brutally short. Most Necron died before reaching what other species would consider middle age, their bodies ravaged by tumors and radiation sickness. This fundamental reality shaped everything about their civilization, from their cultural obsessions to their political structures. The ruling class that emerged from this harsh environment understood that power had to be consolidated quickly and maintained through absolute authority. The noble dynasties arose as those families who controlled the underground cities and radiation-shielded territories, hoarding the limited safe spaces where life could exist with marginally less suffering. These nobles, who would become the overlords, established their dominance through a combination of technological superiority and ruthless suppression of rival claimants. They commanded vast armies of lesser Necron, sending millions to die in territorial conflicts, while they themselves resided in the most protected enclaves their science could create. The Triarch represented the apex of Necron governance, a triumvirate of the three most powerful pharaohs who ruled over the species as a whole. The Silent King, Zarak, held the position of primus among these three, wielding authority that theoretically superseded all other rulers. Alongside him sat two other pharaohs whose identities have been lost to the ages, consumed by the biotransference process and the great sleep that followed. This trinity governed from a position that balanced absolute power with the practical reality that the dynasty overlords commanded their own legions and territories with fierce independence. The Triarch could issue edicts and demand obedience, but enforcement required either overwhelming military force or the cooperation of the autonomous dynasties. Below the Triarch, the hierarchical structure of Necron society functioned through clearly defined ranks of nobility. The pharaohs ruled entire dynasties, controlling multiple worlds and commanding billions of subjects. These supreme rulers answered only to the Triarch, and even that allegiance proved tenuous when their interests diverged from the Silent King's directives. Each pharaoh maintained a court of subordinate overlords, creating a pyramid of power that extended downward through multiple levels of nobility. The Nemesers held positions as supreme military commanders, leading the dynastic legions in campaigns of conquest and defense. These warrior lords possessed tactical genius born from constant warfare, their expertise in battle making them invaluable assets to their pharaohs. Lesser overlords controlled individual worlds, star systems, or military formations. These nobles commanded Necron warriors in the thousands or millions, depending on their rank and the resources allocated to their domains. An overlord's power stemmed from multiple sources: the military forces under their direct command, the territory they controlled, the technological assets they possessed, and most importantly, the favor of their pharaoh. This created a system of patronage and obligation, where overlords competed viciously for advancement, knowing that their short lifespans meant they had limited time to achieve greatness or secure their dynasty's future. The expansion of the Necron Empire across the galaxy began as a desperate attempt to escape their dying star. The overlords drove this expansion with fanatical determination, seeking worlds where their people might live without the constant threat of radiation poisoning. They discovered quickly that while they could colonize other worlds, the damage to their genetic structure proved irreversible. The cancers and mutations followed them across the stars, embedded in their very biology. This realization transformed their expansion from a search for salvation into a campaign of bitter conquest. If they could not escape their suffering, they would at least rule an empire worthy of their pain. The territorial ambitions of the overlords knew no restraint. Each dynasty sought to carve out the largest possible domain, claiming star systems and sectors as their sovereign territory. The overlords who led these expeditions commanded fleets of spacecraft and armies equipped with weapons that could crack continents and boil atmospheres. They encountered other species during this expansion, primitive civilizations that fell before Necron-tier technology, like wheat before the scythe. The Overlords showed no mercy to these lesser beings, viewing them as obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited. Entire species were exterminated to make room for Necron-tier colonies, their world stripped of anything useful before being abandoned or settled. Interdynastic rivalries consumed as much Necron-tier effort as external conquest. The Overlords competed with each other for territory, resources, and prestige with a viciousness that often erupted into open warfare. Border disputes between dynasties could escalate into conflicts involving billions of soldiers and lasting for generations. An overlord who encroached on a rival's territory might find their world subjected to devastating retaliation, their cities reduced to radioactive glass by weapons that made their sun's radiation seem gentle by comparison. These internal conflicts weakened the Necron-tier empire as a whole, but the Overlords seemed incapable of setting aside their ambitions, even when facing external threats. The culture of constant warfare defined the Overlord caste completely. A noble who could not prove themselves in battle held little respect among their peers. The Overlords studied military strategy obsessively, developing tactics and weapon systems that pushed the boundaries of their technology. They led from the front when honor demanded it, commanding their forces personally in battles where a single mistake could mean death. Yet their short lifespans meant that experienced commanders died just as they reached their peak abilities, forcing each generation to relearn lessons written in the blood of their predecessors. This cycle of death and renewal created a military tradition that valued aggression and decisive action over caution or long-term planning. The relationship between the Overlords and the Silent King Zarek existed in a state of permanent tension. Zarek wielded the authority of the Triarch, but the autonomous nature of the dynasties meant that his commands could be ignored or subverted by powerful pharaohs who disagreed with his policies. The Silent King understood that his power ultimately rested on the consent of the dynasty rulers, a consent that could be withdrawn if he pushed too hard against their interests. This created a political dynamic where Zarek had to carefully balance his authority against the independence of the Overlords, using diplomacy, manipulation, and occasional shows of force to maintain the unity of the Necron-tier species. The Overlords viewed the Triarch with a mixture of respect and resentment. They acknowledged Zarek's position as the supreme ruler of their species, but chafed under any restrictions on their autonomy. When the Silent King issued edicts that aligned with their interests, the Overlords followed enthusiastically. When his commands conflicted with their territorial ambitions or dynastic pride, they found ways to delay, minimize, or outright ignore his directives. This resistance rarely took the form of open rebellion, as challenging the Triarch directly risked uniting the other dynasties against the rebel. Instead, the Overlords practiced subtle defiance, paying lip service to Zarek's authority while pursuing their own agendas. The political structure of the Necron-tier empire required constant negotiation and maneuvering. Zarek maintained his position through a combination of personal prestige, military strength, and political acumen. He cultivated alliances with powerful pharaohs, offering them favorable terms and support against their rivals in exchange for loyalty to the Triarch. He played dynasties against each other, ensuring that no single pharaoh or coalition of overlords could accumulate enough power to challenge his authority. This balance of power system kept the empire functioning, but it also prevented the Necron-tier from achieving true unity. The energy spent on internal politics and dynastic conflicts drained resources that could have been directed toward external threats or scientific advancement. The discovery of the Old Ones and their mastery of the webway ignited jealousy and rage among the overlords that would reshape galactic history. These ancient beings possessed the biological immortality that the Necron-tier craved, living for millions of years, while the Necron-tier died in mere decades. The Old Ones refused to share their knowledge with the Necron-tier, viewing them as a barbaric and warlike species unworthy of such gifts. This rejection struck at the core of Necron-tier existence, transforming their expansion from territorial conquest into a crusade against those who hoarded the secret of eternal life. The overlords demanded war against the Old Ones, and the Silent King, Recognizing the unity this cause created among the fractious dynasties, agreed to lead them into what would become the War in Heaven. The War in Heaven ground on for millions of years, consuming entire star systems and killing billions of Necron with each passing millennium. The Overlords commanded their legions with increasing desperation as the conflict turned against them. The Old Ones proved far more powerful than the Necron had anticipated, wielding technologies that manipulated the fundamental structure of reality itself. They created warrior races specifically designed to fight the Necron, unleashing the Krork and Eldar upon the galaxy with devastating effect. The Overlords watched their armies shattered repeatedly, their territorial gains reversed, their dynasties bled white by casualties that mounted faster than their populations could replace them. The short Necron lifespan, once merely a source of cultural anguish, became a critical strategic weakness as experienced commanders died and had to be replaced by inexperienced successors who lacked the knowledge to fight effectively. The Khatan emerged from the stellar void as beings of pure energy, feeding on the radiation of stars. The Necron encountered these entities during their desperate search for any advantage against the Old Ones. The star gods existed as vast consciousnesses without true physical form, drifting through space in a state that barely qualified as sentience. The Necron scientists, led by the greatest minds their species had produced, developed necrodermis bodies that could contain and give shape to these energy beings. This act of hubris would doom the Necron more thoroughly than any military defeat could have achieved. The Khatan, given form and awareness through Necron technology, quickly demonstrated intelligence and cunning that far exceeded their previous state. They looked upon the Necron and saw not allies but prey. The entity known as the Deceiver Mephitron approached the Silent King with promises that spoke directly to every fear and desire the Necron possessed. The Khatan claimed they could offer the Necron immortality, bodies that would never age or sicken, strength beyond anything flesh could achieve. They would become beings of living metal, immune to the radiation that had plagued their species since the beginning of their existence. The Deceiver painted visions of Necron warriors who could not die, who would march through the webway and tear down the Old One's civilization with immortal hands. Zarek listened to these promises while his people died in numbers that threatened the species' survival. The Overlords, gathered in council, demanded that the Silent King accept whatever terms the Khatan offered. They could not win the war in heaven in their current forms, and death through transformation seemed preferable to extinction at the hands of the Old Ones. The Silent King made his decision knowing it would reshape the Necron species forever. He accepted the Khatan's offer on behalf of all Necron, using his authority as the leader of the Triarch to commit every living member of his species to biotransference. The Overlord supported this decision enthusiastically, seeing it as the path to victory and eternal rule. The Khatan, working with Necron scientists who had already begun developing the necessary technologies, constructed vast biotransference furnaces on worlds across the Empire. These facilities would process living Necron and transfer their consciousness into necrodermis bodies, creating what the Khatan promised would be immortal warriors of living metal. The Overlords underwent biotransference before the general population, their status ensuring they received priority in the transformation process. The ruling caste entered the furnaces with their full awareness intact, their minds focused on the power they would gain and the vengeance they would take upon the Old Ones. The process stripped their consciousness from organic bodies and encoded it into crystalline matrices embedded within necrodermis shells. The Khatan had designed the transformation to preserve the mental faculties and personalities of the Overlords specifically, recognizing that they would need commanders who could think strategically and maintain the hierarchical structure of Necron society. The Star Gods intended to use the Necron as their army, and armies required officers who could lead. The necrodermis bodies that housed the Overlords represented the pinnacle of the technology available. These forms stood taller than the shells prepared for common warriors, their frames reinforced and enhanced with additional systems that granted them capabilities far beyond basic Necron warriors. The living metal that composed their bodies could repair damage automatically, reforming after injuries that would have destroyed flesh utterly. Power sources embedded in their chests provided energy that would last for millions of years without diminishing. Optical sensors replaced organic eyes, granting vision across multiple spectrums. Processing cores augmented their consciousness, allowing them to calculate trajectories, analyze tactical situations, and command their forces with superhuman efficiency. The engram protocols encoded into each Necron contained more than just the transferred consciousness. The Khatan and their Necron tier collaborators built hierarchical imperatives directly into the reanimation matrices, creating hardwired command structures that could not be disobeyed. An Overlord's consciousness included command codes that lower-ranked Necrons recognized and obeyed automatically. These protocols functioned below the level of conscious thought, compelling obedience through the fundamental architecture of their artificial existence. A Necron warrior could no more refuse an Overlord's command than it could choose to stop its internal power systems from functioning. This ensured that the military hierarchy of the Necron tier would transfer intact into their new forms, with the Overlords maintaining absolute authority over their subordinates. The preservation of memory and personality varied dramatically based on rank. The Overlords retained vast amounts of their previous existence, their strategic knowledge, tactical experience, and individual personalities surviving the transfer with relatively minimal degradation. They could remember their lives as organic beings, recall the faces of rivals and allies, and maintain the ambitions and grudges that had defined them as Necron tier nobles. This preservation came at the cost of the lower castes, whose consciousness was compressed and simplified to make room for the command protocols and basic functionality needed for warriors. The common Necron tier who became warriors lost almost everything that made them individuals, reduced to automated soldiers who retained only fragments of memory and awareness. The immediate aftermath of biotransference revealed the true horror of what the Khatan had done. The Overlords awakened in their new bodies and discovered that something fundamental had been stolen from them. They could see and hear, process information and issue commands, but they could not feel. The sensation of touch, the taste of food, the warmth of their homeworld sun, the pleasure of physical existence in all its forms had vanished completely. Their consciousness existed in a state of sensory deprivation, experiencing the universe through mechanical sensors that provided data but no genuine sensation. They could register that their metal hand touched an object, but they could not feel its texture or temperature in any meaningful way. Worse than the loss of sensation was the absence they discovered within themselves. The Necron tier had possessed souls, connections to the warp that made them truly alive in a way that transcended mere biological function. The Khatan had consumed these souls during the biotransference process, feeding on the life essence of the entire Necron tier species in the greatest act of predation the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Overlords existed now as consciousness without spirit, awareness without true life. They could think and reason, remember and plan, but the spark that had made them living beings had been devoured by the star gods they had trusted. This realization came gradually as the Overlords tested their new forms and found them hollow, discovering that the immortality they had sought came with a price that could never be repaid. The responses to this discovery varied among the Overlords based on their individual personalities and the strength of their preserved consciousness. Some refused to acknowledge the loss, throwing themselves into military campaigns with renewed ferocity, as if constant warfare could fill the void within them. These Overlords commanded their legions with mechanical precision, pursuing conquest and destruction as their only remaining purpose. They calculated victory conditions and optimized their strategies, becoming perfect military commanders stripped of doubt or mercy. The absence of fear or pain made them terrifying opponents who would sacrifice any number of their warriors to achieve objectives, knowing that their forces would eventually reanimate and return to service. Other Overlords descended into what could only be described as madness, though their mechanical minds could not truly go insane in the way organic brains could. These nobles obsessed over their lost sensations, conducting bizarre experiments in attempts to recover some fragment of feeling. They collected artifacts from their organic past, surrounding themselves with objects they could no longer appreciate beyond visual data. Some became fixated on other species, studying living beings with a combination of scientific curiosity and bitter envy. They watched organic creatures eat, sleep, feel pain and pleasure, experiencing everything the Overlords had lost. This observation sometimes led to cruelty that exceeded anything the Necrontyr had practiced, as these Overlords inflicted suffering on organic beings in attempts to vicariously experience sensation through the reactions of their victims. A smaller number of Overlords turned their anger toward the Khatan themselves. These nobles recognized the deception immediately and began planning revenge even as they led the Necron legions in the continued war against the Old Ones. They could not act openly against the Star Gods, who now commanded power far beyond what any individual Overlord could challenge, but they remembered the betrayal and waited for an opportunity. The Silent King himself fell into this category, his consciousness preserving enough of his former self to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Zarek had condemned his entire species to this hollow existence, and while he continued to rule the Necron legions, he began formulating plans that would take millions of years to execute. The hierarchical structure of the Necron legions functioned more efficiently than the Necrontyr military ever had, precisely because the biotransference had removed the possibility of disobedience. An Overlord could command 1,000,000 warriors to march into a volcano, and they would do so without hesitation, their reanimation protocols ensuring they would eventually return to service even if their bodies were completely destroyed. This made the Necrons a military force of unprecedented effectiveness, capable of sustaining casualties that would break any organic army while maintaining perfect discipline and coordination. The Overlords directed these forces with the strategic knowledge they had accumulated over their organic lifetimes, now enhanced by processing capabilities that allowed them to manage battles across multiple star systems simultaneously. The Khatan used the Necron legions as their personal army, directing the Overlords to wage war according to the Star God's desires, rather than the strategic objectives that would have served Necron interests. The Overlords obeyed because they had no choice in the immediate term, their species now dependent on the Khatan for the technology that maintained their necrodermis bodies and reanimation systems. The war in heaven entered a new phase with the Necrons as the primary military force, their immortal legions pushing back against the Old Ones and their created races. The Overlords commanded battles that reshaped the galaxy, their forces destroying worlds and exterminating species with mechanical efficiency. The Necron legions under Overlord command transformed the war in heaven from a conflict the Necrontyr were losing into a campaign of systematic extermination that threatened the Old One's very existence. The Overlords directed their immortal armies with a ruthlessness impossible during their organic existence, no longer constrained by concerns about casualties or the need to preserve their forces. A Necron phalanx could be annihilated to the last warrior, yet given time those same soldiers would phase back into existence through reanimation protocols, ready to march again under their Overlord's command. This fundamental shift in military capability forced the Old Ones to completely reconsider their defensive strategies, as attrition warfare became meaningless against an enemy that refused to stay dead. The strategic command structures employed by the Overlords during this period established military doctrines that would persist through the Great Sleep and into the 41st millennium. Each dynasty developed its own approach to warfare based on the personalities of its ruling pharaohs and the tactical preferences of its nemessers. The Sautek dynasty, which would later become one of the most powerful Necron dynasties, perfected the relentless advance during the war in heaven. Their Overlords commanded phalanxes of warriors and immortals that marched forward in perfect synchronization, their Gauss weaponry stripping matter apart at the atomic level. Sautek tactical doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower delivered through disciplined formations that never broke regardless of casualties. Their Overlords calculated optimal firing solutions and advance rates, coordinating thousands of warriors with mathematical precision to create kill zones that nothing organic could survive. The Nephrek dynasty took a completely different approach, their overlords mastering the translocation technologies that allowed Necron forces to phase in and out of real space. Nephrek commanders would materialize entire legions directly into enemy strongholds, bypassing defensive lines entirely. Their warriors appeared as if from nowhere, Gauss flares already firing as they solidified from quantum states. The overlords of the Nephrek coordinated these translocation strikes across multiple battlefields simultaneously, creating the impression that their forces existed everywhere at once. Old One defensive positions that should have been impregnable fell in moments as Nephrek forces materialized within their walls, their overlords directing the slaughter with cold efficiency before phasing away to strike elsewhere. The Navak dynasty earned a reputation for terror tactics that made even other Necron overlords regard them with something approaching unease. Navak commanders understood that while they could no longer feel fear themselves, their enemies remained vulnerable to psychological warfare. Their overlords orchestrated campaigns designed to break enemy morale before the actual fighting began. They would attack outlying settlements and leave horrific displays of mechanical precision killing, arranging the dead in patterns that demonstrated the futility of resistance. Navak forces painted their necrodermis in blood-red pigments, their warriors advancing in formations that maximized their visual impact. The overlords of this dynasty studied the psychology of organic species, learning which tactics would most effectively shatter their will to fight. They deployed flayed ones against populations specifically to spread panic, the deranged Necrons serving as weapons of terror as much as instruments of death. The Mephrit dynasty developed what they termed extermination protocols, systematic approaches to warfare that prioritized complete annihilation over quick victory. Mephrit overlords commanded their forces with methodical precision, dividing target worlds into sectors and cleansing each one with absolute thoroughness before moving to the next. Their weapon systems incorporated solar atomics that drew power directly from nearby stars, the overlords wielding destructive capabilities that could sterilize continents. A Mephrit campaign proceeded like a mathematical proof, each step following logically from the previous one, until the inevitable conclusion of total extinction. The overlords of this dynasty maintained detailed records of every world they cleansed, cataloging the species they exterminated with the same dispassionate accuracy they applied to ammunition expenditure calculations. Individual overlords distinguished themselves through campaigns that showcased both their tactical genius and the terrible capabilities of their Necron legions. These commanders led forces numbering in the billions across battlefields that spanned entire star sectors. They coordinated fleet movements through the void while simultaneously directing ground assaults on multiple worlds, their enhanced consciousness allowing them to process tactical data at speeds no organic mind could match. The most successful overlords earned recognition from their pharaons, and even from the Silent King himself, though such recognition meant little when compared to the hollowness they felt within their necrodermis shells. The personal wargear carried by overlords represented technology that exceeded even the already formidable weapons issued to Necron immortals and Lichguard. The warscythe became the signature weapon of overlord rank, a phase weapon that could slice through molecular bonds as if matter itself offered no resistance. These weapons stood taller than a man, their curved blades crackling with disruptive energy fields that phased partially out of sync with real space. An overlord wielding a warscythe could bisect a tank with a single strike, the phase field allowing the blade to pass through armor plating without actually cutting the metal, instead disrupting the atomic structure from within. The weapon's haft incorporated power field generators that could deflect incoming fire, making the warscythe both offensive weapon and defensive tool. Hyperphase swords offered a more refined alternative for overlords who preferred precision to the warscythe's brutal efficiency. These blades existed in a state of quantum flux, their edges vibrating between dimensions at frequencies that made them nearly impossible to parry or block. An overlord could thrust a hyperphase sword through a force field as if it wasn't there, the weapon's quantum state allowing it to bypass conventional defensive technologies. The swords responded to their wielders' neural commands, their phase frequency, adjusting automatically to counter whatever defenses they encountered. Some overlords carried multiple hyperphase swords, their necrodermis bodies strong enough to wield weapons in combat patterns that would have torn organic muscles apart. The tachyon arrow represented single-shot weapons of such devastating power that overlords reserved them for targets that absolutely had to die. These devices fired projectiles that accelerated to faster than light velocities in the instant after launch, crossing the distance to their target in literally zero time from an outside observer's perspective. The arrow hit before it was fired from any meaningful perspective, making defense impossible. The kinetic energy of a tachyon impact vaporized whatever it struck, the target simply ceasing to exist as the arrow converted its mass into expanding plasma. Overlords used these weapons to eliminate enemy commanders, destroy critical infrastructure, or take down war machines that their regular forces couldn't efficiently engage. The technology required to produce tachyon arrows meant each overlord carried only one or two, making every shot a carefully calculated decision. The command of strategic assets elevated overlords beyond merely skilled warriors into true military commanders capable of reshaping battlefields through overwhelming firepower. The Doomsday Arc served as mobile artillery platforms that overlords deployed to break fortified positions and destroy enemy armor concentrations. These vehicles mounted doomsday cannons that fired focused beams of quantum energy, the weapons drawing power from the Ark's own power matrix to generate shots that could crack open fortress walls or vaporize super heavy tanks. An overlord commanding a squadron of doomsday arcs could reduce an entire city to molten slag in hours, the vehicles advancing in formation, while their weapons systematically obliterated anything that might constitute a defensive position. The monolith represented the ultimate expression of Necron military engineering, a floating fortress that combined massive firepower with troop transport capabilities and self-repair systems that made them nearly indestructible. Overlords used monoliths as anchor points for their battle lines, the structures advancing slowly, while their Gauss flux arcs swept the battlefield clear of enemy forces. The Eternity Gate built into each monolith allowed an overlord to teleport reinforcements directly from nearby tomb complexes, maintaining pressure on the enemy regardless of casualties. The particle whip mounted atop the structure fired lightning, like discharges that could destroy multiple targets simultaneously, the weapon's energy arcing between enemy units and reducing entire formations to scattered atoms. Overlords commanding multiple monoliths became mobile siege engines, their forces capable of reducing any fortification to rubble through sustained bombardment. Doom Scythes gave overlords control over the skies, the aircraft combining speed with firepower in platforms that dominated aerial combat. The death ray mounted beneath each scythe carved lines of destruction across battlefields, the weapon's focused beam capable of slicing through armored vehicles like a blade through parchment. Overlords coordinated Doom Scythe squadrons to provide close air support for ground forces, or to conduct independent strikes against enemy installations. The aircraft's Tesla destructors engaged enemy flyers, their lightning arcs jumping between targets and shorting out electronic systems. A skilled overlord could use Doom Scythes to achieve air superiority over entire continents, denying the enemy any ability to maneuver or reinforce their positions. The tactical doctrines employed by overlords during the War in Heaven incorporated these weapons systems into comprehensive strategies that leveraged the Necron's fundamental advantages. An overlord planning an assault would calculate the optimal combination of forces needed to achieve their objective with maximum efficiency. They deployed warriors in massive phalanxes to provide sustained firepower, supported by immortals whose enhanced durability made them effective against elite enemy units. Lychguard protected the overlord personally, their war scythes and dispersion shields forming an impenetrable barrier around their commander. Destroyers provided mobile firepower, their anti-gravity systems allowing them to rapidly reposition while maintaining continuous fire. The integration of these various elements required coordination that would have been impossible for organic commanders, but the Overlords processed battlefield data through their enhanced consciousness with perfect accuracy. They tracked the position and status of every unit under their command, adjusted firing solutions in real time, and predicted enemy movements based on tactical analysis that incorporated millions of variables. An Overlord could identify a weakness in enemy lines and exploit it within seconds, redirecting forces to punch through the gap before the enemy could respond. This level of tactical awareness made the Necron legions devastatingly effective, their attacks unfolding with mechanical precision that organic armies couldn't counter. The war against the Old Ones and their client races ground on for millions of years, the conflict consuming entire regions of the galaxy. The Overlords commanded campaigns that exterminated species the Old Ones had created specifically to fight the Necrons. The Krork, savage warriors who would eventually devolve into the Orcs, fell by the billions to Necron Gauss weapons, their bodies disintegrating into component atoms. The Eldar, psychically gifted and graceful warriors, discovered that their superior mobility meant nothing against an enemy that could phase through space itself. The Overlords studied each enemy species, identified their weaknesses, and developed tactics specifically designed to counter their strengths. They maintained detailed tactical databases that cataloged every engagement, creating an institutional knowledge base that made the Necron legions more effective with each battle. The Katan directed much of this warfare, the Star Gods using the Necron legions to pursue their own agendas rather than strategic objectives that would benefit the Necrons themselves. The Overlords obeyed because they had no choice, their species now completely dependent on Katan technology for their continued existence. Yet even as they followed the Star Gods' commands, some Overlords began planning rebellion. They recognized that the Katan viewed them as tools to be used and discarded, that the Star Gods had no intention of ever releasing the Necrons from servitude. The Silent King himself led this secret resistance, carefully building alliances among Overlords who still retained enough of their consciousness to feel anger at their betrayal. The rebellion against the Katan required preparation that spanned millions of years and coordination across dynasties that had spent their entire existence competing with each other. The Overlords who joined this conspiracy had to maintain absolute secrecy, knowing that if the Katan discovered their plans, the Star Gods could simply deactivate their reanimation protocols and end their existence permanently. Zarek worked through trusted intermediaries, reaching out to pharaons and nemessers whose personalities he remembered from before biotransference, nobles he believed would prioritize vengeance over servitude. The conspiracy grew slowly as more Overlords joined, each one bringing their legions into the fold while maintaining the appearance of loyal service to the Katan. The opportunity for rebellion came as the war in heaven reached its climax. The Old Ones had been pushed to the brink of extinction, their empire shattered and their client races scattered across the galaxy. The Katan, gorged on the souls they had consumed and the energy they had drained from dying stars, had grown complacent. They viewed the Necrons as utterly subservient, incapable of independent action against their masters. This arrogance proved fatal when the Silent King finally gave the order to attack. Overlords across the galaxy turned their legions against the Katan simultaneously, the coordinated assault catching the Star Gods completely unprepared for resistance from their supposedly enslaved army. The weapons the Overlords turned against the Katan were the same technologies they had used to devastating effect against the Old Ones. Doomsday cannons fired at maximum power directly into Katan energy matrices, the quantum disruption tearing at the Star Gods' coherence. Tachyon arrows struck at the weak points in Katan necrodermis shells, the faster-than-light projectiles punching through containment fields that should have been impenetrable. Entire legions of warriors and immortals poured concentrated Gauss fire into individual Katan, the sustained bombardment overwhelming even the Star Gods' ability to regenerate. The Overlords coordinated these attacks with the same precision they had demonstrated throughout the war in heaven, now turned against their former masters with murderous intent. The Katan proved nearly impossible to kill outright, their fundamental nature as energy beings making true death almost meaningless. The Overlords discovered quickly that destroying a Katan's physical shell simply released the entity within, allowing it to potentially escape or possess new vessels. The solution came from Necron cryptechs, who had been secretly developing containment technologies specifically for this purpose. They created devices called tesseract labyrinths, pocket dimensions folded into geometric patterns that could trap Khatan essence indefinitely. The Overlords led assaults designed not to destroy the Khatan, but to shatter them into fragments small enough to be individually contained. The process of shattering the Khatan required firepower on scales that strained even Necron capabilities. Overlords coordinated bombardments from entire fleets, their weapons firing continuously for days or weeks to break down a single Khatan's coherence. As the star gods fractured, other Overlords stood ready with tesseract labyrinths, trapping each shard as it separated from the whole. The Khatan fought back with desperate fury, their powers warping reality and destroying Necron forces by the millions. Overlords watched their legions disintegrated by temporal weapons that aged necrodermis into dust or spatial distortions that compressed entire phalanxes into singularities. Yet the Necrons kept coming, their numbers and coordination eventually overwhelming even the star god's reality warping abilities. The deceiver Mephetron, whose lies had led the Necrontyr into biotransference, became a primary target for Overlord vengeance. Multiple dynasties coordinated their assault on this Khatan specifically, their combined forces finally managing to shatter it into dozens of shards. Each fragment retained a portion of the deceiver's cunning and power, making them dangerous even in their diminished state. The Overlords trapped these shards in tesseract labyrinths, sealing them away where they could never again deceive anyone. Other Khatans suffered similar fates as the rebellion spread, the Nightbringer, the Worldsinger, and the Endless Swarm all falling to coordinated Necron assaults and being shattered into containable fragments. The victory over the Khatan left the Necrons masters of a galaxy that had been reduced to ash. The war in heaven had consumed millions of years and exterminated countless species, leaving behind a cosmos so damaged that reality itself bore scars that would never fully heal. The warp, once a relatively calm dimension that the Old Ones had navigated with ease, had been transformed into a roiling hell of psychic energy. The death screams of quadrillions of sentient beings had fed the immaterium, creating currents of raw emotion and malevolence that made warp travel suicidally dangerous. The Overlords surveyed their empire and found it hollow, their victory as meaningless as their existence had become. They commanded legions that could not die and ruled worlds that held nothing they could enjoy. The silent King Zarek recognized that the Necrons faced extinction despite their military dominance. The shattered Khatan had revealed critical information during their final moments, warnings about the younger races that would eventually evolve to fill the void left by the Old Ones' destruction. The Eldar, already a powerful presence in the galaxy, would grow to dominate vast swathes of space. Other species would emerge from primitive origins to build their own empires. The Necrons, despite their technological superiority and immortal bodies, lacked the numbers to hold the galaxy against the organic life that would inevitably arise. Their species had been reduced to a finite number of consciousness, bearing necrodermis shells, with no possibility of reproduction or population growth. Every Necron destroyed permanently represented an irreplaceable loss, and the war in heaven had already cost them billions. Zarek made the decision that would define the next 60 million years of galactic history. He commanded the Necron dynasties to enter the Great Sleep, a period of stasis during which the younger races would rise and fall while the Necrons slumbered in hidden tomb complexes. The plan called for the dynasties to awaken after sufficient time had passed, emerging into a galaxy where the younger races had exhausted themselves through their own conflicts. The Necrons would then reclaim the galaxy from a position of technological superiority, sweeping aside whatever primitive civilizations had developed during their absence. The Overlords received this command with varying reactions, some recognizing the strategic necessity, while others chafed at the idea of surrendering the empire they had fought so hard to win. The preparation for the Great Sleep required construction efforts that dwarfed even the massive military campaigns of the war in heaven. The Overlords directed their forces to build tomb complexes on worlds across the galaxy, selecting locations based on strategic value, defensibility, and the likelihood of remaining undisturbed for millions of years. These worlds became known as tomb worlds, each one transformed into a vast necropolis that would house entire dynasties in stasis. The construction incorporated technologies that pushed the boundaries of what even the Necrons could achieve, creating structures designed to function autonomously for time periods that exceeded the lifespan of most stars. The tomb complexes themselves extended deep into the planetary crust, their chambers and corridors reaching dozens of kilometers below the surface. The Overlords supervised the construction of throne rooms, where they would spend the Great Sleep, massive chambers decorated with the dynastic symbols and achievements they had accumulated during their existence. These spaces served no practical purpose beyond satisfying the Overlord's need for displays of status and power, but the nobles insisted on them regardless. Each Overlord's throne room reflected their personality and the aesthetic preferences they had carried forward from their organic existence. Some chose austere chambers with minimal decoration, their spaces dominated by the single throne where they would sit in stasis. Others demanded elaborate halls filled with trophy cases displaying weapons taken from defeated enemies, star maps showing the extent of their conquests, and monuments to battles they had commanded. The stasis crypts for the general Necron population occupied the vast majority of each tomb complex's volume. These chambers stretched for kilometers in every direction, their walls lined with alcoves where warriors and immortals would stand in dormancy. The Overlords calculated the exact number of troops they would need upon awakening and ensured their tomb worlds could accommodate those forces plus reserves for anticipated casualties. A typical tomb world might house millions of warriors, hundreds of thousands of immortals, tens of thousands of specialized units like destroyers and death marks, and hundreds of vehicles ranging from ghost arcs to monoliths. The largest tomb worlds, those belonging to pharaohs who ruled entire dynasties, contained populations that numbered in the billions. The canoptech constructs represented the most critical component of the tomb world's long-term survival. These automated systems would maintain the tomb complexes during the Great Sleep, repairing damage, eliminating intruders, and ensuring that the stasis fields functioned correctly for the entire duration of the slumber. The Overlords worked with cryptechs to design and deploy vast numbers of these constructs, creating an autonomous defense and maintenance system that required no conscious oversight. Canoptech wraiths phased through the tomb complex's walls and floors, their dimensional destabilization matrices allowing them to patrol areas that would be inaccessible to conventional guards. These constructs detected structural damage, unauthorized intrusions, and malfunctions in critical systems, responding to threats with particle casters that disintegrated anything they identified as hostile. Canoptech spiders served as mobile repair stations, their multiple limbs equipped with tools that could perform maintenance on everything from basic structural repairs to complex reanimation protocol adjustments. These constructs scuttled through the tomb complexes on legs that could navigate any terrain, their fabricator claw arrays manufacturing replacement components as needed. Each spider carried gloom prisms that projected defensive fields, protecting them from attack while they performed their duties. The Overlords programmed these constructs with detailed instructions covering millions of potential scenarios, creating decision trees that would allow the spiders to respond appropriately to situations that might not occur for millions of years. Canoptech scarabs functioned as the most numerous maintenance constructs, swarms of these small devices patrolling every chamber and corridor of the tomb complexes. Each scarab possessed limited individual intelligence, but operated as part of a swarm mind that could coordinate responses to threats or damage across entire sections of a tomb world. The scarabs consumed matter to fuel their internal reactors and to provide raw materials for repairs, their mandibles capable of breaking down anything from stone to metal into component atoms. When tomb damage occurred, scarab swarms would converge on the affected area and begin reconstruction, their collective efforts capable of rebuilding entire chambers given sufficient time. The tomb stalkers and tomb sentinels represented the tomb world's primary defense against serious intrusions. These massive constructs burrowed through solid rock as easily as organic creatures moved through water, their segmented bodies allowing them to navigate the tightest spaces, while their Gauss weaponry could engage threats at any range. The Overlords programmed these constructs with aggressive defense protocols, ensuring they would respond to any significant intrusion with overwhelming force. A tomb stalker detecting intruders would tunnel directly to their location and emerge in their midst, its multiple weapon systems engaging targets before the invaders could react to its presence. The hierarchical structure of each tomb world reflected the dynastic system that had governed the Necron tier and continued to define Necron society. At the apex sat the Overlord who ruled the world, their authority absolute over everything within their domain. For tomb worlds that housed portions of larger dynasties, this Overlord answered to a pharaoh who commanded multiple worlds, but within their own territory, their word was law. The Overlord's court consisted of subordinate nobles who had sworn fealty during the Necron tier era and maintained those oaths through biotransference and into the Great Sleep. These lesser nobles commanded specific legions or controlled particular territories within the tomb world's domain, their positions defined by ancient agreements and dynastic tradition. The cryptechs occupied a unique position within tomb world hierarchies, their technical expertise making them invaluable despite their typically lower noble rank. These scientist-sorcerers maintained the tomb complex's most critical systems, their understanding of Necron technology exceeding even what most Overlords possessed. The relationship between Overlords and their cryptechs combined elements of master and servant with mutual dependency. An Overlord commanded the cryptechs assigned to their court, but they also relied on those cryptechs to maintain the systems that kept their entire dynasty functional. Smart Overlords treated their cryptechs with a degree of respect unusual for the otherwise rigid Necron hierarchy, recognizing that alienating these specialists could have catastrophic consequences. The Lich-Guard formed the Overlord's personal bodyguard, elite warriors whose loyalty had been hardwired into their reanimation protocols even more deeply than the standard command hierarchies. These guards had served their Overlord during the Necron tier era, their consciousness preserved with greater fidelity than common warriors specifically to maintain the personal relationships that made them effective protectors. A Lich Guard could recognize their Overlord individually, remember specific events from their shared past, and anticipate their master's needs based on millions of years of service. The Overlord selected Lich Guard from among their most trusted retainers, warriors who had proven their loyalty through countless battles and political intrigues. The legions of warriors that made up the bulk of each tomb world's military force existed at the bottom of this hierarchy, their simplified consciousness allowing them to follow orders but little else. These warriors had been common Necron tier, soldiers and civilians whose individuality had been almost completely erased during biotransference. They retained only the most basic memories and personality fragments, enough to give them slight variations in behavior, but not enough to qualify as true sentience. The Overlords viewed these warriors as tools rather than subjects, their worth measured entirely by their combat effectiveness and the resources required to maintain them. The varying fates of tomb worlds during the Great Sleep would not become apparent until the Awakening began, but the Overlords attempted to account for every possible threat when designing their stasis protocols. They selected worlds in stable star systems, avoiding regions with high asteroid density or unusual stellar phenomena that might damage the tomb complexes. They buried their tombs deep enough to survive all but the most catastrophic tectonic events, reinforcing the structures with stasis fields that would protect them from seismic activity. They installed sensors that would detect external threats and activate defense protocols automatically, ensuring that the canoptech constructs would respond to dangers even while the Necrons themselves slumbered. Despite these precautions, the Overlords knew that 60 million years represented a time span that defied meaningful prediction. Stars would die and be born, continents would shift, and cosmic events beyond their ability to foresee would reshape the galaxy. Some tomb worlds would inevitably be destroyed or damaged beyond the canoptech construct's ability to repair. The Overlords accepted these losses as the price of the Great Sleep, calculating that enough tomb worlds would survive to make the strategy viable. They prepared redundant systems, backup protocols, and failsafe mechanisms, but ultimately they would be gambling their entire species' future on technologies designed to function without oversight for longer than most civilizations would exist. The awakening protocols built into each tomb world systems incorporated multiple triggering conditions that would bring the Overlords back from stasis. The most basic protocol involved a simple timer, counting down the millions of years until a predetermined awakening date. This ensured that even if nothing else functioned correctly, the tomb worlds would eventually revive their inhabitants and allow them to assess the galaxy's state. The Overlords set these timers for different durations across various tomb worlds, creating a staggered awakening that would prevent the entire species from emerging simultaneously into potentially hostile conditions. Threat detection systems provided another awakening trigger, their sensors monitoring for signs of activity that might indicate the tomb world faced danger. These systems could detect seismic disturbances that suggested mining or excavation near the tomb complex, energy signatures consistent with weapons fire or spacecraft engines, and even the presence of living beings above certain concentration thresholds. When these sensors registered sufficient threat levels, they would initiate emergency awakening protocols for defensive forces, bringing online enough warriors and constructs to eliminate the danger before it could damage critical systems. If the threat proved severe enough, the protocols would awaken the Overlord themselves, allowing them to direct the response personally. The most sophisticated awakening protocols monitored the galaxy itself, using long-range sensors to detect the rise of civilizations that might threaten Necron interests. These systems tracked electromagnetic emissions, warp disturbances, and other signs of advanced technology, building a picture of galactic development while the Necrons slept. When these sensors detected civilizations reaching certain technological thresholds, they would trigger awakening sequences calibrated to the perceived threat level. A primitive species developing basic spaceflight might warrant awakening a small defensive force, while the emergence of a galaxy-spanning empire could trigger full dynastic revival. The Silent King issued his final commands before entering his own stasis, his orders programmed into the command hierarchies that governed every tomb world. Zarek directed the dynasties to remain in stasis until the younger races had sufficiently developed, specifically waiting for humanity to rise and create an empire worthy of conquest. The Silent King recognized that humans possessed potential that exceeded most organic species, their adaptability and aggression making them the most likely candidates to dominate the galaxy during the Necrons' absence. By timing the awakening to coincide with humanity's peak, the Necrons would emerge to face an enemy at the height of their power, ensuring that the coming conflicts would test the dynasties and eliminate the weak while strengthening those who survived. The Overlords entered their stasis thrones with final thoughts that varied as much as their preserved personalities. Some looked forward to the awakening, anticipating the wars of reconquest they would wage against whatever species had claimed their territory. Others felt nothing but the emptiness that had defined their existence since biotransference, their consciousness dimming into dormancy without emotion or expectation. A few harbored doubts about whether they would ever awaken at all, wondering if the Great Sleep might prove permanent, an eternal darkness that would finally end their hollow immortality. These thoughts faded as the stasis fields activated, their consciousness suspending in a state that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't true awareness either. The tomb worlds fell silent as the last Necrons entered stasis, their vast complexes becoming crypts housing the remains of a species that had conquered the galaxy and found the victory meaningless. The Canoptech constructs began their eternal vigil, patrolling corridors that would see no conscious footsteps for millions of years. The galaxy moved on without the Necrons, new species rising from primitive origins to build civilizations that would never know the sleeping threat buried beneath ancient worlds. The Overlords dreamed, if their mechanical consciousness could be said to dream at all, of the empire they had lost and the vengeance they would take when they finally awakened to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The first tomb worlds began their awakening cycles in the 38th millennium, their chronometric systems reaching predetermined thresholds after approximately 58 million years of dormancy. The overlords who emerged from stasis found their consciousness returning in stages, awareness flickering through their necrodermis frames as power systems that had lain dormant for geological ages stuttered back to life. The transition from complete suspension to full functionality took varying amounts of time depending on the condition of each tomb world systems. Some overlords achieved complete awareness within hours, their reanimation protocols executing flawlessly. Others required days or weeks to fully restore their consciousness, their engram matrices corrupted by temporal degradation or damaged by the very stasis fields meant to preserve them. The galaxy that greeted these awakening overlords bore almost no resemblance to the empire they had abandoned. The stellar cartography stored in tomb world databases showed star systems that had shifted position over millions of years of galactic rotation. Entire constellations had changed as stars died and new ones formed from collapsing nebulae. The overlords accessed their navigational systems and discovered that the reference points they had used during the war in heaven no longer existed in recognizable forms. Stars that had served as waypoints for Necron fleets had gone supernova or collapsed into neutron stars. Binary systems had merged or been torn apart by gravitational interactions. The fundamental structure of local space had transformed while they slept. The species that now inhabited the galaxy proved even more shocking than the astronomical changes. The overlords detected electromagnetic emissions consistent with advanced technology across vast swathes of space, their long-range sensors picking up signs of civilizations that had achieved interstellar travel and established empires spanning thousands of worlds. The dominant power called itself the Imperium of Man, a galaxy-spanning empire centered on the world designated Terra in Necron star charts. The humans who comprised this Imperium had developed technologies that, while primitive compared to Necron capabilities, demonstrated sophistication far beyond what the overlords had expected from species that should have still been confined to single worlds. The overlords analyzed the data their sensors collected and recognized the Imperium as the primary threat to Necron resurgence. Human settlements existed on worlds the dynasties had claimed before the Great Sleep, their cities built atop ruins that the humans clearly didn't recognize as Necron construction. Human mining operations had penetrated deep into planetary crusts, some coming dangerously close to tomb complexes that still housed dormant dynasties. Human military forces demonstrated capabilities that would require significant Necron strength to overcome, their warships mounting weapons that could crack continents, and their ground forces equipped with armor and weapons that exceeded the technology level of most species the Necrons had exterminated during the war in heaven. The Eldari presented another unwelcome surprise for the awakening overlords. The species that the Necrons had fought during the war in heaven had not only survived, but had apparently dominated the galaxy for millions of years before suffering some catastrophic collapse. The overlords detected the remnants of an empire that must have been vast beyond comprehension, its ruins scattered across worlds that bore signs of technology the Necrons grudgingly recognized as sophisticated. The Eldari who remained existed in scattered factions, some inhabiting massive spacecraft called craftworlds that drifted through the void, others lurking in a dimension the Necrons identified as the webway their Old One creators had built. These Eldari remnants still possessed potent military capabilities despite their diminished state. Their weapons and tactics evolved over the millions of years the Necrons had slept. The Orcs infested the galaxy like a plague, their presence detected on thousands of worlds across every sector the Overlords surveyed. These creatures descended from the Krork the Old Ones had created to fight the Necrons, though they had clearly degenerated significantly from their original form. The Overlords recognized biological markers and technological signatures that connected these primitive brutes to the sophisticated warriors they had faced during the war in heaven. The Orcs had somehow survived the intervening millions of years and spread across the galaxy through a combination of extreme resilience and aggressive expansion. Their presence on worlds the dynasties had claimed represented an infestation that would require systematic extermination. The fragmented nature of the Necron awakening became apparent as Overlords attempted to establish contact with other tomb worlds and received no response. The network of communication systems the dynasties had built before the Great Sleep should have allowed instant coordination across the entire Necron Empire, but the Overlords discovered that most of these systems had failed during the long dormancy. Quantum entanglement communicators had lost coherence, their paired particles decaying over timescales that exceeded their design specifications. Relay stations built to amplify signals across interstellar distances had been destroyed by cosmic events or simply worn down by entropy. The Overlords found themselves isolated, their awareness limited to what their individual tomb world sensors could detect. Some tomb worlds had suffered catastrophic failures that prevented awakening entirely. The Overlords who did revive detected these dead worlds through the absence of expected signals, their automated systems broadcasting nothing but silence where entire dynasties should have been stirring. Investigations of the nearest dead tomb worlds revealed the scope of damage the Great Sleep had inflicted. Tectonic shifts had crushed entire sections of tomb complexes, the planetary crust grinding through chambers that housed millions of dormant warriors. Asteroid impacts had penetrated deep enough to breach outer tomb defenses, the kinetic energy of mountain-sized rocks shattering stasis crypts and destroying the Necrons within. Stellar radiation from nearby supernovae had degraded reanimation protocols beyond the Canoptech construct's ability to repair, leaving entire populations trapped in permanent dormancy. The degradation of Overlord personality matrices represented perhaps the most insidious damage the Great Sleep had inflicted. The engram protocols that preserved Necron consciousness had been designed to function for millions of years, but 60 million years exceeded even Necron-tier engineering tolerances. The Overlords who awakened discovered that portions of their memories had corrupted, entire epochs of their existence reduced to fragmented data or lost completely. Some found that they could remember the war in heaven with perfect clarity, but had lost all memory of their organic existence as Necron-tier. Others retained memories of their mortal lives, but discovered gaps in their recollection of the biotransference or the rebellion against the Khatan. The severity of this degradation varied wildly between individual Overlords based on factors that included the quality of their original biotransference, the stability of their tomb world stasis fields, and simple chance. Some nobles awakened with their personalities essentially intact, their consciousness suffering only minor data loss that manifested as occasional gaps in memory or slightly reduced processing efficiency. These fortunate Overlords could remember their names, their dynasties, their achievements, and their relationships with other nobles. They retained the strategic knowledge and tactical expertise they had accumulated over millions of years of warfare, their military capabilities undiminished by the Great Sleep. Other Overlords suffered far more severe degradation that fundamentally altered their consciousness. These nobles awakened to discover that they had forgotten their own names, their memories reduced to scattered impressions and disconnected data fragments. They knew they had commanded legions and conquered worlds, but the specific details had been lost to temporal decay. Their personalities had been compressed and simplified, complex emotions and motivations reduced to basic imperatives like the need to reclaim territory or destroy enemies. Some of these degraded Overlords retained enough awareness to recognize what they had lost, their diminished consciousness still capable of understanding that they were shadows of what they had been. Others lacked even that insight, their engram matrices so corrupted that they functioned as little more than sophisticated automatons following pre-programmed directives. The most severely damaged Overlords descended into what could only be described as madness, though the term applied imperfectly to mechanical consciousness. These nobles awakened with their personality matrices corrupted in ways that produced behavior patterns completely divorced from rational thought. Some became obsessed with meaningless tasks, their consciousness locked into loops that compelled them to perform the same actions repeatedly without purpose or end. Others developed what appeared to be paranoid delusions, their corrupted engrams generating false memories and phantom threats that they responded to with military force. A few emerged with their hierarchical imperatives, inverted or scrambled, issuing contradictory commands to their forces, or attacking other Necron units they should have recognized as allies. The tomb worlds themselves had suffered varying degrees of physical damage that the Canoptech constructs had repaired with mixed success. The Overlords who awakened in complexes that had remained relatively intact found their domains much as they had left them, the throne rooms and stasis crypts maintained in perfect condition by tireless mechanical servants. These fortunate nobles commanded full legions of warriors and immortals, their military strength undiminished by the Great Sleep. Their vehicle pools contained functional doomsday arcs, ghost arcs, and monoliths ready for immediate deployment. Their defense systems remained operational, the tomb world's weapons prepared to engage any threat that approached their territory. Other overlords awakened to devastation that reduced their military capabilities to fractions of what they had possessed before the Great Sleep. Sections of their tomb complexes had collapsed, burying entire legions under millions of tons of rock that the Canoptech constructs had been unable to clear. Water infiltration from underground aquifers had flooded chambers, the moisture corroding necrodermis and damaging reanimation systems in ways that prevented revival. Seismic activity had severed power conduits, leaving portions of tomb worlds without the energy needed to sustain their inhabitants. These damaged complexes yielded far smaller forces than their overlords had expected, entire phalanxes of warriors reduced to scattered squads, vehicle pools depleted to single digits, and specialized units like Deathmarks or Lichguard almost completely absent. The territories the Overlords had claimed before the Great Sleep now hosted civilizations that had no knowledge of Necron ownership or the sleeping threat buried beneath their worlds. Human colonists had established cities and industrial complexes on tomb worlds, their populations numbering in the millions or billions, depending on the planet's habitability and strategic value. Orc warbands had claimed other worlds, their ramshackle settlements spreading like fungal growths across surfaces the Necrons considered their sovereign territory. Eldari exotic communities had settled on worlds with minimal technology, their populations living in apparent harmony with local ecosystems, while remaining completely unaware of the ancient complexes beneath their feet. The Overlords responded to these intrusions with immediate military action, their first conscious thoughts upon awakening focused on purging their territories of organic contamination. The initial campaigns of reclamation began within hours or days of revival, as Overlords activated their military forces and directed them toward the surface. These early strikes demonstrated the fundamental superiority of Necron technology over the weapons systems employed by the younger races, but they also revealed the challenges the dynasties would face in reclaiming their empire. The organic species had numbers that dwarfed the depleted Necron legions, their populations measured in billions or trillions across thousands of worlds, while individual tomb worlds might house only millions of warriors. The Overlords who commanded the first surface assaults employed tactics refined during the War in Heaven, their military doctrines adapted to account for the specific capabilities of their new enemies. Against human settlements, the Necrons deployed phalanxes of warriors supported by ghost arcs that maintained reanimation protocols across the battlefield. The humans fought with projectile weapons that fired explosive rounds, their soldiers protected by armored suits that could withstand significant punishment. The Necron Gauss flayers stripped this armor away at the molecular level, the humans' protective equipment disintegrating to reveal the vulnerable flesh beneath. The human defenders demonstrated courage that the Overlords recognized as tactically irrational, their soldiers holding positions long past the point where retreat would have been the logical choice. The human military forces responded to Necron attacks with strategies that indicated sophisticated command structures and combined arms doctrine. They deployed armored vehicles that mounted cannons capable of destroying individual warriors, their explosive shells shattering necrodermis when they achieved direct hits. Human aircraft strafed Necron formations with rockets and energy weapons, their pilots demonstrating skill that exceeded what the Overlords expected from organic beings with limited lifespans. Artillery batteries bombarded Necron positions from beyond visual range, their shells guided by targeting systems that tracked Necron movements with reasonable accuracy. The humans coordinated infantry, armor, and air support in ways that suggested military traditions developed over thousands of years of warfare. Despite their tactical competence, the humans proved incapable of achieving decisive victories against even depleted Necron forces. The reanimation protocols that allowed destroyed warriors to phase back into existence negated the humans' numerical advantages, their casualties mounting, while the Necrons maintained consistent force strength. The Overlords directed their forces with processing capabilities that allowed them to coordinate attacks across entire continents simultaneously, their consciousness managing tactical details that would have overwhelmed organic commanders. Human positions fell one after another as Necron phalanxes advanced with mechanical precision, their Gauss weapons reducing fortifications to atomic dust. The Orc infestations presented different challenges that forced the Overlords to adapt their tactical approaches. The Greenskins fought with a savagery that exceeded even the Krork the Necrons had faced during the War in Heaven, their degraded forms compensating for lost sophistication with raw aggression and numbers that seemed to multiply regardless of casualties inflicted. Orc warbands charged directly into Necron firing lines, their crude weapons blazing as they closed to melee range where they could bring their physical strength to bear. The Overlords discovered that Orcs could tear apart individual warriors through brute force, their massive hands ripping necrodermis limbs from torsos and crushing skulls that contained consciousness matrices. The Necron response to Orc aggression involved increasing the density of their firing lines and deploying heavier weapon systems that could eliminate entire mobs before they reached melee range. Doomsday Arcs positioned behind warrior phalanxes fired their main weapons into the largest Orc concentrations, the quantum beams vaporizing dozens of greenskins with each shot. Destroyers floated above the battlefield on anti-gravity systems, their Gauss cannons tracking individual Orc leaders and eliminating them with sustained fire. The Overlords recognized that Orc psychology centered on following the strongest members of their species, and systematically targeted these leaders to break the Greenskins' cohesion. The tactic proved only partially effective as new Orc bosses emerged to replace those killed, the species' social structure adapting to losses with disturbing speed. The Eldari remnants demonstrated capabilities that genuinely concerned the Overlords who encountered them. These aliens moved with speed that made targeting them difficult even for Necron weapon systems, their bodies enhanced through biological engineering or psychic manipulation that exceeded anything the Eldar had possessed during the War in Heaven. Eldari weapons fired projectiles that could penetrate necrodermis, their shuriken catapults launching monomolecular discs that sliced through living metal with alarming efficiency. Eldari psykers wielded powers drawn from the warp, their abilities allowing them to manipulate reality in ways that bypassed conventional defenses. The Overlords watched Eldari warlocks tear apart warrior squads with psychic lightning or crush immortals with telekinetic force, their powers representing threats that Necron technology struggled to counter effectively. The campaigns to purge tomb worlds of organic infestation proceeded at different rates depending on the strength of forces each Overlord commanded and the resistance they encountered. Some tomb worlds were cleansed within weeks, as overwhelming Necron military superiority crushed relatively weak human colonies or small Orc populations. The Overlords directed their warriors to systematically eliminate every organic being on these worlds, their forces moving from settlement to settlement with mechanical thoroughness. Survivors who fled into wilderness areas found themselves hunted by death marks that phased in from pocket dimensions to eliminate targets with precision Gauss fire. Canoptech constructs scoured the cleansed worlds for any remaining organic contamination, their sensors detecting life signs that human technology couldn't hide. Other tomb worlds required months or years to fully reclaim as entrenched human populations or massive Orc infestations fought with desperate determination. The overlords commanding these campaigns discovered that the younger races had developed their own sophisticated military doctrines during the millions of years of Necron dormancy. Human defenders employed fortification techniques that channeled Necron attacks into killing zones, where concentrated fire could overwhelm even reanimation protocols. They deployed specialized weapons designed to counter specific Necron capabilities, electromagnetic pulse devices that temporarily disrupted necrodermis systems, or graviton guns that could immobilize Necron constructs. The orcs adapted their tactics based on battlefield experience, learning to target Necron vehicles and constructs rather than wasting ammunition on warriors that would simply reanimate. The overlords established beachheads in the systems surrounding their tomb worlds, their forces expanding outward to secure strategic resources and eliminate threats before they could threaten the dynasty's core territories. These expansion campaigns revealed the true scale of the challenge facing the Necrons. The galaxy contained thousands of inhabited systems for every tomb world that had successfully awakened, the younger races having filled the void left by the Necrons' absence, with civilizations that controlled resources and territory on scales that dwarfed individual dynasties. The overlords recognized that reclaiming their empire would require coordination between multiple tomb worlds and dynasties, but the collapse of the ancient communication networks made such coordination nearly impossible. Some overlords attempted to re-establish contact with neighboring tomb worlds, dispatching scout forces to investigate nearby systems that should have housed other dynasties. These expeditions discovered the full extent of the damage the Great Sleep had inflicted on the Necron Empire. Dead tomb worlds that broadcast no signals yielded only silent crypts filled with Necrons who would never awaken, their consciousness matrices degraded beyond any possibility of recovery. Other tomb worlds remained in stasis, their chronometric systems apparently still counting down toward awakening dates that might be centuries or millennia in the future. A few investigations located tomb worlds that had awakened, but whose overlords had been so severely damaged by personality matrix degradation that they couldn't recognize other Necrons as allies, their corrupted consciousness interpreting all contact as hostile and responding with immediate military force. The successful re-establishment of communication between functional tomb worlds proceeded slowly as overlords rebuilt the relay networks that had once spanned the galaxy. Cryptechs worked to restore quantum entanglement communicators, carefully re-establishing coherence between paired particles that had maintained their connection despite 60 million years of separation. These restored communication links allowed overlords to coordinate their campaigns and share intelligence about the younger race's capabilities and dispositions. The information exchanged through these channels painted a picture of a galaxy far more dangerous than the overlords had anticipated, their species awakening into a cosmos that would contest every world they attempted to reclaim. The restoration of communication between awakened tomb worlds revealed the extent to which the ancient dynastic hierarchies had survived the Great Sleep intact. The overlords who established contact with their former superiors discovered that the command structures built during the Necrontier era remained fundamentally unchanged, the protocols encoded into their reanimation matrices preserving relationships of fealty and obligation that predated biotransference by thousands of years. A lesser overlord who had sworn service to a pharaon before the Great Sleep found those oaths still binding, their consciousness compelled to acknowledge their superior's authority through imperatives hardwired into their very existence. The dynasties that had fragmented across the galaxy during the Awakening began reassembling themselves as these ancient bonds reasserted themselves, overlords reaching out to locate their pharaons and receive orders that would direct their campaigns of reconquest. The pharaons who ruled the great dynasties commanded authority that superseded all lesser nobles within their domain. These supreme rulers had governed multiple star systems during the Necrontier era, their territories encompassing dozens or hundreds of worlds that owed them tribute and military service. The biotransference had preserved their consciousness with exceptional fidelity, the Khatan recognizing that the command structure of the Necron legions required leaders capable of strategic thinking on scales that encompassed entire sectors of space. A pharaon awakening in the 41st millennium retained memories of campaigns fought during the war in heaven, political alliances forged and broken over millions of years, and the specific capabilities and limitations of every overlord who served within their dynasty. This institutional knowledge made them invaluable for coordinating the scattered tomb worlds and directing them toward common objectives. The pharaon of the Sadek dynasty, Imhotep the Stormlord, emerged from stasis with his personality matrix almost completely intact. His tomb world of Mandragora had survived the Great Sleep with minimal damage. The Canoptech constructs maintaining his stasis systems in perfect working order for the entire duration of the slumber. Imhotep awakened to find his strategic genius undiminished, his consciousness still capable of the tactical calculations that had made him one of the most feared commanders during the war in heaven. He immediately began re-establishing contact with the overlords who served within the Sadek dynasty, his commands transmitted through the restored communication networks reaching tomb worlds across multiple sectors. The overlords who received these orders found themselves compelled to obey through the hierarchical protocols in their engram matrices, their consciousness recognizing Imhotep's authority as absolute within the dynastic structure. The relationship between pharaons and their subordinate overlords balanced centralized authority with practical autonomy. A pharaon could issue strategic directives that all overlords within the dynasty were obligated to follow, their commands carrying the weight of ancient oaths and hardwired imperatives. An overlord who received orders to assault a specific star system or eliminate a particular threat would execute those commands with the full resources at their disposal, their forces committed to achieving the objectives their pharaon had defined. Yet within the parameters of these strategic directives, the overlords maintained significant freedom to determine their own tactical approaches and manage their territories as they saw fit. A pharaon might command an overlord to conquer a sector, but the specific methods employed and the allocation of forces remained at the overlord's discretion. This balance of authority and autonomy created a command structure that allowed the dynasties to operate across vast distances while maintaining unified strategic direction. The overlords served as semi-autonomous military commanders who could respond to local conditions without requiring constant guidance from their pharaon. They assessed threats within their territories, allocated their forces to address those threats, and prosecuted campaigns according to tactical doctrines they had developed over millions of years of warfare. The pharaon monitored these activities through reports transmitted via the communication networks, intervening only when an overlord's actions diverged from dynastic objectives or when coordination between multiple overlords became necessary for large-scale operations. The Nemessers occupied a unique position within this hierarchy as supreme military commanders whose authority derived from tactical expertise rather than territorial control. These warrior lords had earned their rank through demonstrated genius in battlefield command, their strategic acumen making them invaluable assets to their pharaons. A Nemesser coordinated the military operations of multiple overlords during large-scale campaigns, their consciousness processing tactical data from across entire war zones and issuing orders that synchronized the efforts of forces that might be separated by light years of distance. The relationship between Nemessers and the overlords they commanded during campaigns existed in a state of productive tension, the overlords obligated to follow the Nemessers' tactical directives while maintaining their own authority over their personal legions and territories. The coordination of multiple overlords under a Nemesser's command required communication systems and tactical protocols that pushed the limits of Necron technology. The Nemesser established a command network that linked their consciousness directly to the overlords participating in the campaign, creating a tactical mesh that allowed real-time coordination across distances that would make conventional command and control impossible. Through this network, the Nemesser monitored the disposition of every unit under their authority, tracked the progress of objectives across multiple battlefields, and issued orders that arrived instantaneously regardless of the physical separation between forces. The overlords connected to this network retain their individual consciousness and command authority, but they experience the Nemesser's strategic vision as a constant presence in their awareness. Their tactical decisions influenced by the broader operational picture only the Supreme Commander could perceive. The distinction between a Nemesser's military authority and an overlord's political power created situations where strategic genius and territorial control existed in separate individuals. An overlord might rule vast territories and command millions of warriors, their political authority within the dynasty second only to the pharaoh themselves. Yet during military campaigns, they would defer to a Nemesser, whose territorial holdings consisted of a single tomb world, but whose tactical expertise exceeded anything the overlord possessed. This separation of political and military authority prevented the concentration of too much power in single individuals, while ensuring that campaigns were directed by those most qualified to achieve victory. The system functioned because the hierarchical protocols encoded in Necron consciousness made disobedience to legitimate authority essentially impossible, the overlords following Nemesser commands during campaigns, even when those orders contradicted their personal preferences or territorial interests. The courts that surrounded each overlord consisted of specialists and advisors whose expertise supplemented the overlord's own capabilities. The royal wardens served as the overlord's primary military deputies, their consciousness programmed with tactical subroutines that made them exceptional battlefield commanders. These wardens coordinated the overlord's forces during engagements, their relocation protocols allowing them to teleport across the battlefield to wherever their presence was most needed. A royal warden monitored the disposition of warrior phalanxes and immortal squads, identifying weak points in their formations and redeploying units to address threats before they could exploit those vulnerabilities. They served as the overlord's eyes on the battlefield, their sensor feeds providing detailed tactical data that informed command decisions. The cryptechs who served in overlord courts represented multiple disciplines of Necron technological mastery, each specialization providing capabilities that enhanced the dynasty's military effectiveness. The plasmancers wielded control over solar energies, their weapons channeling the power of stars into focused beams that could vaporize enemy formations. These specialists studied the fundamental forces that governed stellar fusion, their understanding allowing them to manipulate plasma states with precision that exceeded anything the younger races had achieved. An overlord commanding a plasmancer could call down solar fire on enemy positions, the specialist directing energies that turned battlefields into lakes of molten glass. The plasmancers also maintained the tomb world's power systems, their expertise ensuring that the reactors and energy conduits that sustained the dynasty functioned at optimal efficiency. The chronomancers manipulated temporal fields through technologies that the overlords themselves only partially understood. These specialists could slow time within localized areas, creating zones where enemy movements became glacial while Necron forces operated at normal speed. They could accelerate the passage of time around damaged warriors, allowing reanimation protocols to complete in seconds rather than minutes. The most skilled chronomancers created temporal loops that trapped enemies in repeating moments, their consciousness experiencing the same instant of death over and over while their bodies remained frozen in space. The overlords valued these specialists for their ability to control the flow of battle, their temporal manipulation providing advantages that no amount of conventional firepower could match. The psychomancers studied the organic mind. Their research focused on understanding and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of species that still possessed biological brains. These cryptechs had developed technologies that induced terror, madness, and despair in enemy forces, their weapons attacking the consciousness rather than the body. A psychomancer could broadcast neural patterns that triggered primal fears in human soldiers, their minds overwhelmed by terror that had no rational basis but felt absolutely real to those experiencing it. They could induce hallucinations that made enemies see their allies as threats, turning organized military units into confused mobs that fired on each other. The Overlords deployed psychomancers against enemies whose morale represented a critical weakness, the specialists breaking the will to fight before conventional forces engaged. The technomancers maintained the Overlords' military assets, their expertise extending to every weapon system and vehicle in the dynasty's arsenal. These specialists supervised the canoptech constructs that performed routine maintenance, but they personally attended to the most critical systems and the most sophisticated technologies. A technomancer ensured that the Overlord's doomsday arcs maintained optimal firing calibration, that the monolith's eternity gates remained synchronized with the tomb world's translocation matrix, and that the Gauss weaponry issued to warriors functioned within acceptable parameters. They also directed battlefield repairs, their eldritch lances serving as both weapons and tools that could restore damaged necrodermis or reanimate warriors whose reanimation protocols had failed. The Lich Guard who protected each Overlord represented the elite of Necron military forces, their consciousness preserved with fidelity that approached what the Overlords themselves enjoyed. These guards had served their master during the Necrontyr era, their loyalty tested through countless battles and political intrigues that preceded biotransference. The transformation into necrodermis had enhanced their already formidable combat capabilities, their frames reinforced beyond even immortal specifications, and equipped with weapons that marked them as the Overlord's chosen protectors. The warscythes they carried could cleave through tank armor with single strikes, the phase blades passing through matter, as if it offered no resistance before disrupting the target's atomic structure from within. The hyperphase swords some Lich Guard preferred allowed for more precise strikes, their quantum-edged blades capable of penetrating any defense the younger races had developed. The dispersion shields carried by some Lich Guard units provided protection that extended to the Overlord they guarded, the energy fields capable of intercepting incoming fire and redirecting it back toward the attackers. A squad of Lich Guard with dispersion shields could advance through withering fire, their shields absorbing Laz bolts, plasma blasts, and even artillery shells before reflecting that energy back across the battlefield. The Overlords positioned these guards at critical points in their battle lines, their presence providing anchors around which entire formations could rally. The Lich Guard maintained their positions with mechanical determination, their consciousness programmed with imperatives that made retreat or surrender literally inconceivable. They would fight until their necrodermis frames were reduced to scattered atoms, and even then their reanimation protocols would eventually restore them to continue their eternal vigil. The political dynamics within each dynasty created webs of alliance, rivalry, and intrigue that had persisted since the Necrontyr era. The Overlords who served the same Pharaon competed with each other for resources, prestigious assignments, and their master's favor. These competitions rarely involved direct military conflict between Overlords of the same dynasty, as the hierarchical protocols made such internal warfare difficult to initiate and sustain. Instead, the rivalries manifested through more subtle means that the Overlords had perfected over millions of years of practice. An Overlord might delay providing military support to a rival during a critical campaign, their forces arriving just late enough that the rival suffered embarrassing casualties while technically fulfilling their obligations. They might present intelligence about threats in ways that made a rival's territory appear more vulnerable than their own, influencing the Pharaon's strategic decisions to direct resources away from competitors. The ancient grudges that had survived biotransference and the Great Sleep provided endless fuel for these political conflicts. Overlords remembered territorial disputes from the Necrontyr era, their consciousness preserving the details of borders violated and resources stolen with perfect clarity despite 60 million years of stasis. They recalled insults delivered during court functions, slights to their honor that demanded satisfaction through means the rigid hierarchy made difficult to pursue openly. Some grudges originated from the war in heaven itself, Overlords blaming rivals for tactical failures that had resulted in the destruction of their forces or the loss of territories they had claimed. The biotransference had stripped away the emotional heat that had originally fueled these conflicts, but the facts remained in their memory matrices, and the Overlords pursued their vendettas with mechanical persistence that never wavered or forgot. The territorial disputes that arose as Tomb Worlds awakened created new sources of conflict between Overlords. The stellar cartography stored in Tomb World databases showed boundaries and territorial claims that had been established before the Great Sleep, but 60 million years had rendered many of these boundaries meaningless. Star systems that had been firmly within one Overlord's territory now lay in disputed space between multiple Tomb Worlds, their ownership unclear based on ancient records that contradicted each other. Habitable worlds that had been worthless during the Necrontyr era had become valuable strategic assets in the 41st millennium, their populations and resources making them prizes worth fighting over. The Overlords filed competing claims with their pharaons, presenting evidence from ancient archives to support their territorial demands while simultaneously deploying forces to physically occupy the disputed territories. The competition for the pharaons' favor drove much of the internal political maneuvering within dynasties. An Overlord who earned their master's approval might receive priority access to awakening Tomb Worlds, allowing them to expand their forces more rapidly than rivals. They might be assigned the most prestigious military campaigns, operations that offered opportunities for glory and the acquisition of resources from conquered territories. The pharaons' favor could manifest in more subtle ways as well, their support during disputes with other Overlords carrying weight that could determine the outcome of territorial conflicts or resource allocation decisions. The Overlords cultivated this favor through military success, efficient administration of their territories, and careful management of their relationship with their pharaons' court. The cryptechs who served various Overlords within a dynasty formed their own networks of cooperation and rivalry that existed parallel to the political structures of the nobility. These specialists traded knowledge and research findings, their collective expertise advancing Necron technology in ways that individual cryptechs working in isolation could never achieve. Yet they also competed for recognition and resources, their rivalry expressed through demonstrations of technical superiority and the development of weapons or systems that exceeded what their peers had created. A plasmancer might develop a new solar weapon specifically to outperform a rival's design, the competition between specialists driving innovation that benefited the dynasty as a whole even as it fed their individual ambitions. The relationship between Overlords and their cryptech advisors required careful management, as these specialists possessed knowledge that made them valuable but also potentially threatening. A cryptech understood the systems that sustained their Overlord's consciousness and maintained their necrodermis frame, their technical expertise giving them theoretical ability to damage or destroy their master if they chose rebellion. The hierarchical protocols made such betrayal difficult, but not impossible for a cryptech whose consciousness had degraded in ways that corrupted their loyalty imperatives. The Overlords managed this risk through a combination of rewards for faithful service and the implicit threat of permanent deactivation for those who proved unreliable. They also ensured that no single cryptech possessed complete knowledge of all critical systems, distributing technical expertise across multiple specialists so that losing any individual would not cripple the dynasty's capabilities. The courts assembled by the most powerful Overlords rivaled those of lesser pharaons in their size and sophistication. These nobles commanded multiple cryptechs representing different disciplines, their combined expertise providing capabilities that exceeded what most dynasties could field. They maintained large Lichguard contingents that served not just as bodyguards, but as elite strike forces capable of independent operations. Their royal wardens coordinated forces across multiple star systems, their tactical networks managing campaigns that would overwhelm lesser commanders. These elaborate courts represented the Overlord's power and prestige within the dynasty, their ability to attract and retain talented specialists, demonstrating the resources and influence they commanded. The military assets controlled by individual Overlords varied dramatically based on the size of their territories and the condition of their tomb worlds after the Great Sleep. An Overlord whose tomb world had survived intact might command millions of warriors organized into phalanxes that could overwhelm any opposition through sheer weight of Gauss fire. Their vehicle pools might contain hundreds of ghost arcs to maintain reanimation coverage across vast battlefields, dozens of doomsday arcs to provide heavy fire support, and multiple monoliths to serve as mobile fortresses. The most powerful overlords deployed tesseract vaults that contained Khatan shards, the imprisoned star god fragments serving as weapons of apocalyptic power that could reshape battlefields through reality warping abilities. Other overlords commanded far more modest forces, their military strength limited by tomb world damage or the small size of their pre-sleep territories. These nobles might lead forces numbering in the thousands rather than millions, their campaigns necessarily focused on objectives that matched their limited resources. They compensated for numerical weakness through tactical excellence and the efficient use of specialized assets, their death marks eliminating enemy commanders, while their Lichguard held critical positions against overwhelming odds. These lesser overlords often found themselves serving as subordinates during large campaigns, their forces integrated into larger armies commanded by nemessers or more powerful overlords. The awakening of the Tomb Worlds in the 41st millennium revealed that certain overlords had emerged from the Great Sleep, with their capabilities not merely intact, but seemingly enhanced by the long dormancy. These exceptional nobles commanded dynasties or domains that quickly established themselves as major powers in the galaxy, their military campaigns and territorial ambitions reshaping entire sectors. Their personalities, preserved with unusual fidelity through the biotransference and stasis, made them individuals rather than mere automatons executing pre-programmed directives. The younger races that encountered these overlords discovered that the Necrons possessed leaders whose tactical genius and strategic vision rivaled or exceeded the greatest commanders their own species had produced. Imodic the Stormlord ruled the Sodek dynasty from his throne world of Mandragora, his authority extending across hundreds of tomb worlds that recognized his supremacy. The Pharaon had awakened with his consciousness almost perfectly preserved, his memories of the war in heaven and the Necrontyr era remaining sharp and detailed despite 60 million years of stasis. His strategic genius manifested in campaigns that demonstrated an understanding of warfare that transcended mere tactical competence. Imodic perceived battles not as isolated engagements, but as components of larger strategic patterns that played out across decades or centuries. He calculated the political and military consequences of every action, his decisions accounting for variables that other commanders never considered. When Imodic committed forces to a campaign, he had already war-gamed dozens of potential outcomes and prepared contingencies for each one. The Vidar sector became the focus of Imodic's initial campaigns of reconquest, the region containing multiple tomb worlds that had once sworn fealty to the Sodek dynasty. The Pharaon coordinated the awakening of these subordinate tomb worlds, his commands transmitted through restored communication networks reaching overlords who had served under his authority during the Necrontyr era. These nobles found their hierarchical protocols compelling them to acknowledge Imodic's supremacy, their consciousness recognizing his command codes as legitimate and binding. Within decades of his own awakening, Imodic had assembled military forces that numbered in the hundreds of millions, the combined legions of multiple tomb worlds operating under unified strategic direction for the first time since the Great Sleep began. The human populations that inhabited the Vidar sector discovered the true meaning of Necron military efficiency when Imodic's forces began their systematic conquest. The Pharaon identified key worlds whose capture would compromise the Imperium's ability to defend the entire sector, his analysis revealing supply routes, communication hubs, and strategic strongpoints that human commanders had thought secure. Sodek forces struck these targets simultaneously, their attacks coordinated with precision that made it appear as if a single vast army operated across light years of space. Human defenders found themselves fighting battles that seemed disconnected from each other, but were actually components of a single massive operation designed to collapse their defensive network from within. Emotic's forces advanced with the relentless efficiency that characterized Sodic tactical doctrine, their phalanxes of warriors marching forward in perfect synchronization, while Doomsday arcs reduced fortifications to molten craters. The Orc Empire of Cheredin represented a threat that even Emotic's strategic genius struggled to fully neutralize. The greenskin warlord Gozkul Mag Uruk Thraka commanded Orc forces that numbered in the billions, their ramshackle fleets and crude weapons backed by numbers that exceeded anything the Sotek dynasty could match. Emotic recognized the Orcs as a problem that required solutions beyond conventional military force. The Greenskins reproduced through spores that spread across every world they touched, their biology making permanent extermination nearly impossible without rendering entire planets lifeless. The Pharaon adapted his strategy to account for this reality. His campaigns against Cheredin focused on containing the Orc expansion rather than achieving total victory. Sodic forces established kill zones around Orc-held systems, their fleets intercepting greenskin vessels before they could spread to new territories. The rivalry between Emotic and Gozkul evolved into a conflict that transcended simple territorial disputes. The Pharaon studied the Orc warlords' tactics and recognized in Gozkul a strategic intelligence that exceeded what greenskins should possess. The Orcs' campaigns demonstrated coordination and planning that suggested either exceptional individual genius or the influence of some external force guiding his actions. Emotic responded by deploying forces specifically configured to counter Orc strengths, his destroyers targeting the largest greenskin mobs, while Deathmarks eliminated Orc leaders before they could organize effective resistance. The conflict settled into a grinding stalemate, as neither side could achieve decisive advantage, the Orcs' numbers balancing against Necron technological superiority in battles that consumed entire star systems. The ambition that drove Emotic extended beyond merely reclaiming Sodic territories. The Pharaon studied the fragmented state of the Necron species and concluded that their survival required unification under centralized leadership. He envisioned himself as the supreme ruler of all Necron dynasties, a new silent king who would coordinate the scattered tomb worlds and direct them toward the systematic reconquest of the galaxy. This ambition required careful political maneuvering alongside military success, as the other pharaohs guarded their independence jealously and would resist any attempt to subordinate them to another's authority. Emotic worked to expand Sotek influence through a combination of military alliances, demonstrations of superior strategic capability, and the calculated distribution of resources to dynasties that acknowledged his leadership. The Stormlord's court on Mandragora reflected the sophistication of his rule and the resources he commanded. Cryptex representing every major discipline served in his retinue, their combined expertise making the Sodic dynasty's technological capabilities unmatched by any other awakened dynasty. His Lichguard numbered in the thousands, their ranks filled with warriors whose consciousness had been preserved with exceptional fidelity, specifically because of their importance to the Pharaon's personal security. The royal wardens who coordinated Sodic military operations possessed tactical subroutines that Emotic had personally refined, their consciousness enhanced with strategic protocols that made them extensions of the Pharaon's own military genius. The court functioned with efficiency that made it a model other dynasties attempted to emulate, its systems and hierarchies optimized through millions of years of refinement. Anraker the Traveler represented a completely different approach to existence in the 41st millennium, his response to the awakening defined by circumstances that set him apart from other overlords. His tomb world had been destroyed during the Great Sleep, the complex suffering catastrophic failure that left Anraker as one of the few survivors from his entire dynasty. The Overlord awakened to find himself effectively alone, his court destroyed, and his armies reduced to a handful of warriors and specialists who had survived the disaster through chance rather than design. Rather than attempting to establish a new domain or swear fealty to another pharaoh, Anraker chose a path that would define his existence for centuries to come. He became the Traveler, an overlord without territory who journeyed across the galaxy, seeking tomb worlds that remained dormant and working to awaken the dynasties that slumbered within them. The motivation driving Anraker's endless travels combined practical necessity with something approaching idealism, though that term applied imperfectly to Necron consciousness. He recognized that the scattered, fragmented state of the Necron species made them vulnerable to the younger races despite their technological superiority. Every tomb world that remained dormant represented military strength that could not contribute to the species' survival. Every dynasty that slept while the Imperium expanded its territories was a missed opportunity to reclaim worlds that had once belonged to the Necrons. Anraker dedicated himself to correcting this situation through direct action, his forces traveling from system to system to locate dormant tomb worlds and initiate their awakening sequences. The process of awakening a tomb world required technical expertise that exceeded what most overlords possessed. Many tomb worlds remained dormant, not because their chronometric systems had failed to reach their trigger points, but because damage to critical systems prevented the awakening sequences from executing properly. Power conduits severed by tectonic shifts left entire sections of tomb complexes without the energy needed to revive their inhabitants. Reanimation protocol failures trapped Necrons in permanent stasis, their consciousness unable to transfer back into their necrodermis frames. Control systems corrupted by temporal degradation issued contradictory commands that locked tomb worlds into loops they couldn't escape without external intervention. Anraker commanded cryptechs, whose specializations allowed them to diagnose and repair these failures, their technical knowledge making the Traveler's mission possible. The campaigns Anraker conducted to reach dormant tomb worlds often required military action against whatever species had claimed the territories surrounding them. The Overlord discovered tomb worlds buried beneath human cities, their complexes unknown to the populations living directly above them. He found others on worlds the Orcs had infested, the Greenskins completely unaware of the ancient technology beneath their ramshackle settlements. Eldari exotic communities had established themselves on tomb worlds, their populations living in harmony with local ecosystems while remaining ignorant of the sleeping threat in the planetary crust. Anraker's forces assaulted these populations with the same mechanical efficiency any Necron army employed, his warriors advancing in disciplined phalanxes while his specialists worked to access the tomb complexes and initiate awakening protocols. The reception Anraker received from the dynasties he awakened varied dramatically based on the personalities of their overlords and the condition they found themselves in upon revival. Some greeted the Traveler as a savior, their gratitude for his intervention manifesting in offers of alliance and military support. These dynasties provided Anraker with additional forces to replace casualties his own troops had suffered, their warriors and vehicles joining his army to assist with future awakening operations. Other overlords responded to their revival with suspicion or outright hostility, their damaged consciousness interpreting Anraker's presence as a threat rather than assistance. These nobles sometimes attacked the Traveler's forces immediately upon awakening, their corrupted engrams preventing them from recognizing other Necrons as allies. Anraker's troops defended themselves with the minimum force necessary, their commander understanding that these attacks resulted from malfunction rather than genuine hostility. The most frustrating responses came from overlords who awakened intact but refused to acknowledge any obligation to Anraker for his assistance. These nobles accepted their revival as their due, viewing the Traveler as a servant who had merely performed his function, rather than a peer who deserved gratitude or compensation. They dismissed Anraker's forces from their territories immediately after awakening, their territorial instincts making them unwilling to tolerate another Overlord's military presence within their domains. The Traveler accepted these dismissals without protest, his mission focused on awakening dormant dynasties rather than accumulating personal power or territory. He moved on to locate the next sleeping tomb world, his forces traveling through the void toward systems where ancient Necron signals suggested the presence of dormant complexes. The reputation Anraker accumulated through his travels made him a figure of legend among the awakening dynasties. Stories of the Traveler spread through the restored communication networks, overlords sharing accounts of his interventions, and the dynasties he had saved from permanent dormancy. Some viewed him with respect bordering on reverence, their consciousness recognizing that his selfless dedication to awakening other tomb worlds served the entire Necron species rather than personal ambition. Others regarded him with suspicion, questioning what motivated an overlord to abandon the pursuit of territory and power in favor of endless wandering. These suspicious nobles theorized that Anraker harbored secret ambitions, that he awakened dynasties specifically to place them in his debt and build a network of obligations he would eventually call upon to establish his own empire. Trazyn the Infinite represented perhaps the most unusual overlord to emerge from the Great Sleep, his personality and priorities diverging so dramatically from standard Necron behavior that other nobles struggled to categorize him. The Overlord of Solemnness had awakened with his consciousness, not merely intact, but seemingly enhanced by obsessions that had only intensified during the long stasis. Trazyn styled himself an archaeovist and collector, his existence dedicated to acquiring artifacts, specimens, and historical objects that he preserved in vast galleries beneath his tomb world. These collections encompassed items from every era of galactic history, their scope and diversity exceeding anything the younger races had assembled in their museums or archives. Trazyn's galleries contained weapons from the war in heaven, artifacts from civilizations that had risen and fallen during the Necron's slumber, and specimens of species that had gone extinct millions of years before humanity discovered fire. The methods Trazyn employed to acquire additions to his collection ranged from legitimate archaeological excavation to outright theft executed with precision that made detection nearly impossible. The Overlord deployed forces to battlefields specifically to acquire specimens while the fighting raged, his warriors phasing in to snatch commanders, vehicles, or artifacts before phasing out again with their prizes. He infiltrated museums and private collections using surrogate hosts, mind-shackle scarabs allowing him to possess organic beings and use their bodies to move through secured facilities. The technology transferred his consciousness into the host's brain while suppressing their own awareness, giving Trazyn complete control over their actions while maintaining the appearance of normal behavior. These possessed agents walked past security systems designed to detect Necron infiltration, their organic bodies registering as harmless, while Trazyn's consciousness directed them to steal priceless artifacts. The Tesseract labyrinths Trazyn employed represented technology that exceeded even standard Necron capabilities, their construction requiring expertise that only the most skilled cryptechs possessed. These devices created pocket dimensions folded into geometric patterns that existed outside normal space, their interiors capable of holding objects or beings in perfect stasis indefinitely. Trazyn used Tesseract labyrinths to store his most valuable acquisitions, the artifacts preserved in conditions that prevented any degradation or damage. The largest specimens in his collection occupied their own dedicated labyrinths, entire armies frozen in mid-battle or spacecraft, suspended in the moment before impact. The Overlord could release these stored specimens at will, the Tesseract labyrinths opening to deploy their contents directly onto battlefields where they served as weapons or distractions. The interference Trazyn conducted in galactic events stemmed from his desire to acquire specific specimens or preserve historical moments he deemed significant. The Overlord monitored conflicts across the galaxy through sensor networks that fed data to his tomb world's archives, his consciousness analyzing these events for acquisition opportunities. When he identified battles or situations that would produce specimens worthy of his collection, Trazyn deployed forces to intervene directly in the events. His warriors materialized on battlefields to capture specific individuals, their targeting protocols, identifying commanders, heroes, or unique specimens that the Overlord wanted to preserve. These interventions sometimes altered the outcomes of battles in ways that affected entire campaigns, Trazyn's acquisitions removing key figures whose presence or absence changed the balance of forces. The peculiar sense of honor that governed Trazyn's behavior made him unpredictable even by Necron standards. The Overlord maintained agreements he made with other species when those agreements served his collection's interests. His consciousness, recognizing that reputation for reliability, made future negotiations possible. He returned artifacts he had borrowed when the terms he had agreed to required their return, though he often retained perfect copies created through molecular scanning that rendered the duplicates indistinguishable from originals. Trazyn collaborated with other overlords when their objectives aligned with his acquisition goals, his forces providing support during campaigns in exchange for first access to artifacts or specimens the battles produced. These collaborations ended immediately once Trazyn obtained what he wanted, the Overlord withdrawing his forces regardless of whether the larger campaign had concluded. The galleries beneath Solemnus contained specimens that would terrify the younger races if they understood what Trazyn had collected. Entire space marine companies stood frozen in tesseract labyrinths, their warriors suspended in the moment of battle, with their weapons raised and their war cries frozen on their lips. Elder aspect warriors occupied their own displays, their graceful forms captured mid-leap or in the instant before their weapons discharged. Orc warbosses stood alongside their retinues, the greenskinned savage expressions preserved perfectly. Human Imperial Guard regiments filled massive galleries, their ranks stretching for hundreds of meters as thousands of soldiers stood in formation. The Overlord had even acquired specimens from the Horus Heresy, ancient warriors whose armor bore heraldry from legions that no longer existed in the 41st millennium. Nemesser Zondrek of Gidrim commanded respect and pity in equal measure from other overlords who learned his story. The Nemesser had been one of the greatest military minds the Necrontyr had produced, his tactical genius earning him rank and glory during the final centuries before biotransference. The transformation into Necrodermis and the subsequent Great Sleep had damaged his engram matrices in ways that corrupted his perception of reality, while leaving his strategic capabilities mysteriously intact. Zondrek awakened believing that he remained a Necrontyr noble, his consciousness unable to process that he had been transformed into a machine, or that 60 million years had passed since he last commanded organic soldiers. He perceived his Necrodermis body as flesh, his warriors as living Necrontyr troops, and the enemies he fought as rival dynasties, competing for territory in conflicts that resembled those of the Necrontyr era. The delusion that governed Zondrek's existence manifested in behavior that other overlords found both tragic and tactically brilliant. The Nemesser conducted his campaigns according to codes of honor that had governed Necrontyr warfare, his forces observing protocols that made no sense in conflicts against species that had never heard of these ancient traditions. He sent heralds to enemy commanders before battles, these warriors programmed to deliver formal challenges and declarations of intent that confused human officers who received them. Zondrek offered honorable surrender terms to defeated enemies, his consciousness genuinely believing that these organic beings were Necrontyr nobles who deserved the courtesies due to worthy opponents. He took prisoners rather than exterminating defeated forces, his warriors restraining enemy soldiers and transporting them to holding facilities where they remained in stasis until Zondrek decided their fate. The strategic brilliance that Zondrek demonstrated despite his corrupted consciousness amazed other overlords who studied his campaigns. The Nemesser's tactical decisions remained as sound as they had been during the Necrontyr era, his analysis of battlefield conditions and enemy capabilities showing no degradation despite the delusions that colored his perception. He identified weak points in enemy defenses with the same genius that had made him legendary during the war in Heaven, his forces exploiting these vulnerabilities with precision that achieved victory after victory. Zondrek coordinated multi-front campaigns across entire star systems, his consciousness managing tactical details that would overwhelm lesser commanders while maintaining the strategic vision that ensured each battle contributed to larger operational objectives. The contrast between his delusional perception and his intact tactical genius created a commander who was simultaneously mad and brilliant. Vargard Oberon served as Zondrek's loyal bodyguard and the only being who understood the true extent of his master's condition. The Vargard had been Zondrek's friend during the Necrontyr era, their relationship predating the formal bonds of service that biotransference had encoded into their consciousness. Oberon's engram matrices had survived the transformation and great sleep with perfect clarity, his awareness of what they had become making him uniquely positioned to understand the tragedy of Zondrek's delusion. The vanguard protected his master not just from physical threats, but from situations that might shatter the comfortable fiction Zondrek's damaged consciousness had constructed. He eliminated evidence that might reveal the truth about their mechanical nature, his warriors removing reflective surfaces that might show Zondrek his necrodermis form or destroying recordings that captured their voices' mechanical tones. The loyalty Oberon demonstrated transcended the hierarchical protocols that bound other Necrons to their masters. The vanguard chose to serve Zondrek, his consciousness making this decision independently rather than following programmed imperatives. He could have assumed command of Gidrum's forces himself, his tactical capabilities and intact consciousness making him qualified to rule, but Oberon subordinated his own ambitions to protect the Nemesser, whose friendship he valued above rank or territory. The vanguard translated Zondrek's orders, when necessary, converting commands that referenced Necron-tier protocols into directives that Gidrum's forces could execute in the 41st millennium. He managed the diplomatic complications that arose from his master's behavior, his explanations and interventions preventing other overlords from dismissing Zondrek as too damaged to command effectively. The combat capabilities Oberon possessed made him a terror on battlefields where Zondrek's forces engaged. The vanguard wielded a warscythe whose phase blade had been enhanced beyond standard specifications, the weapon capable of cleaving through armor that would resist normal Necron weapons. His necrodermis frame incorporated translocation systems that allowed him to teleport across battlefields instantaneously, his form phasing out of existence in one location and materializing in another without traversing the space between. Oberon used this capability to protect Zondrek from threats the Nemesser's delusions prevented him from recognizing, the vanguard appearing between his master and enemy assassins, or teleporting directly into enemy formations to eliminate commanders before they could threaten Gidrum's forces. The combination of loyalty, tactical skill, and raw combat power made Oberon one of the most formidable vanguards any dynasty had produced. The personal armaments carried by Necron Overlords represented technology that exceeded the weapons issued to lesser ranks by orders of magnitude. These instruments of destruction had been crafted during the final days of the Necron-tier Empire, or forged in the furnaces of the war in heaven, their designs refined through millions of years of warfare against enemies that ranged from the old ones themselves to the countless species those ancient beings had created. The overlords who wielded these weapons understood their capabilities with the intimate knowledge that came from having used them across battlefields that span the galaxy, their consciousness retaining tactical data about optimal firing solutions, effective ranges, and the specific effects each weapon produced against different target types. The hyperphase sword existed in a state of quantum uncertainty that made it one of the most devastating close combat weapons the Necrons had developed. The blade phased between dimensions at frequencies measured in microseconds, its edge existing simultaneously in real space and in dimensional states that conventional matter couldn't interact with normally. When an overlord struck with a hyperphase sword, the weapon passed through armor, force fields, and physical barriers as if they weren't present, the quantum phasing allowing the blade to bypass these defenses entirely. The disruption occurred at the molecular level as the sword's edge interacted with the target's atomic structure during the brief instance it existed in real space, the oscillating phase frequency tearing apart molecular bonds and reducing whatever it touched to its component atoms. An overlord could thrust a hyperphase sword through a space marine's power armor without the blade ever actually cutting the ceramite, the weapon instead disrupting the material's atomic cohesion from within and allowing the blade to emerge from the other side of the target, as if the armor had been liquid rather than solid. The warscythe combined the hyperphase blade technology with integrated Gauss weaponry in a single weapon that served as both melee instrument and ranged armament. The curved blade mounted on a shaft that stood taller than most organic warriors' incorporated phase field generators that created the same quantum uncertainty effect as hyperphase swords, but on a larger scale. The weapon's size and the power of its phase fields meant that an overlord wielding a warscythe could bisect armored vehicles with single strikes, the blade passing through tank armor and cutting through the vehicle's internal structure without resistance. The haft of the warscythe housed a Gauss projector that fired focused beams capable of stripping matter apart at range. The weapon's targeting system slaved to the overlord's optical sensors to ensure perfect accuracy. An overlord could sweep the warscythe in wide arcs to cut down multiple enemies in melee, while simultaneously firing the integrated Gauss weapon at targets beyond immediate reach, the combination of capabilities making the warscythe the signature weapon of Necron nobility. The Staff of Light represented a more refined approach to combining melee and ranged capabilities in a single weapon system. These devices appeared as ornate staffs topped with focusing crystals that channeled energy from the Overlord's internal power matrix into coherent beams. The Gauss projector built into the staff fired with greater accuracy than the weapons mounted on warscythes, the staff's design prioritizing precision over raw destructive power. The crystal focus could modulate the beam's intensity, allowing the Overlord to adjust their fire from shots that merely disabled targets to maximum power strikes that disintegrated them completely. The staff's shaft incorporated phase field generators similar to those in hyperphase swords, though with reduced effect, the weapon capable of functioning as a melee implement when enemies closed to hand-to-hand range. Overlords who preferred tactical flexibility over specialized combat effectiveness favored Staffs of Light, the weapons providing reliable performance in any combat situation without the warscythe's bias toward melee engagement. The Tachyon arrow represented single-shot weaponry of such devastating power that Overlords reserved these devices for targets that absolutely required elimination, regardless of cost. The technology accelerated a projectile to faster-than-light velocities through dimensional manipulation that briefly created a corridor through which the arrow could travel at superluminal speeds. The physics involved meant that from an outside observer's perspective, the arrow hit its target in the same instant it was fired, the projectile crossing the intervening space in literally zero time. The kinetic energy released by a tachyon impact exceeded anything conventional weapons could produce, the target simply ceasing to exist as the arrow's mass converted to plasma that expanded outward in a spherical shockwave. The technology required to produce tachyon arrows meant that each weapon could only be fired once before requiring complete reconstruction in specialized facilities, making every shot a carefully calculated decision that Overlords made only when facing enemies whose elimination justified expending such rare resources. The defensive systems and enhancements available to Overlords provided protection that went beyond the inherent durability of their necrodermis frames. The phylactery represented emergency translocation technology that could save an Overlord from situations that would otherwise result in their destruction. These devices monitored the Overlord's combat status continuously, their sensors tracking damage levels and threat assessments in real time. When the phylactery detected that its bearer faced imminent destruction, it activated translocation protocols that teleported the Overlord directly back to their tomb world regardless of distance or intervening obstacles. The translocation occurred faster than organic reflexes could track, the Overlord's form phasing out of existence on the battlefield and rematerializing in the safety of their throne room within microseconds. The technology drew enormous power from the tomb world's reactors to achieve translocation across interstellar distances, meaning phylacteries could only activate a limited number of times before requiring recharging periods that could last months. The Resurrection Orb enhanced the reanimation protocols of Necron warriors and immortals within its effective radius, the device broadcasting command codes that prioritized the reconstruction of damaged necrodermis and accelerated the transfer of consciousness back into repaired frames. An Overlord carrying a Resurrection Orb could maintain their force's combat effectiveness even under sustained fire, that would normally deplete a Necron, phalanx through accumulated damage. Warriors who fell to enemy weapons would phase back into existence within seconds rather than minutes, their forms reassembling from scattered particles, as the resurrection orb's enhanced protocols directed the reanimation process. The orb's broadcasts also improved the quality of repairs, ensuring that warriors returned to combat with their systems functioning at optimal efficiency rather than the degraded performance that sometimes resulted from hasty field repairs. Overlords leading assaults into heavily defended positions valued resurrection orbs for their ability to maintain pressure on enemies who expected that inflicting casualties would eventually break the Necron advance. The sempiternal weave reinforced the Overlord's necrodermis beyond the already formidable durability standard Necron construction provided. These enhancement systems incorporated additional layers of living metal woven into the Overlord's frame at the molecular level, creating redundant structural supports that distributed damage across the entire body rather than allowing it to concentrate in specific areas. The weave responded to damage by flowing to reinforce threatened sections, the living metal shifting to present maximum resistance to incoming attacks. An Overlord protected by sempiternal weave could withstand hits from weapons that would shatter lesser Necron frames, their enhanced structure absorbing kinetic impacts that would cave in unprotected necrodermis. The weave also accelerated self-repair processes, the additional living metal providing raw materials that damage repair systems could use to reconstruct destroyed sections without drawing from the Overlord's primary structural components. The Mindshackle Scarabs represented one of the most insidious weapons in the Overlord's arsenal, these devices attacking enemy commanders through direct neural interface rather than conventional combat. Each scarab consisted of a canoptech construct small enough to remain undetected by most organic sensory systems, its form designed to burrow into the target's skull and interface directly with their brain. Once attached, the scarab began broadcasting neural patterns that overrode the victim's voluntary control over their own body, the device effectively enslaving them to the Overlord's will. The enslaved commander remained conscious and aware of what was happening, but found themselves unable to resist the commands transmitted through the scarab, their body moving and speaking according to directions that originated from the Overlord rather than their own consciousness. The psychological horror this induced in organic beings made Mindshackle Scarabs particularly effective against species that valued individual autonomy, the victim's awareness of their enslavement often breaking their will more effectively than any physical torture. The command vehicles that carried Overlords into battle provided both mobility and symbolic authority that reinforced their position at the apex of Necron military hierarchies. The Catacomb Command Barge served as the most common transport for Overlords directing battlefield operations, these anti-gravity platforms combining speed with the elevated position necessary for commanders to survey the fighting below them. The barge's design incorporated a raised platform where the Overlord stood, their form visible to both their own forces and the enemy as a clear indicator of command presence. The vehicle's systems included sophisticated communication, arrays that maintained contact with all units under the Overlord's authority, the command network allowing them to issue orders and receive status updates in real time regardless of battlefield conditions. The barge mounted defensive systems that projected energy fields capable of deflecting incoming fire, protecting both the vehicle and its passenger from weapons that might otherwise threaten them. The tactical advantages provided by command barges extended beyond simple transportation. The elevated position allowed Overlords to observe battlefield developments that ground-level commanders might miss, their optical sensors scanning across entire war zones to identify threats and opportunities as they emerged. The barge's speed meant that Overlords could reposition themselves rapidly to respond to changing tactical situations, their mobility ensuring they remained where their presence would have maximum effect. The psychological impact of an Overlord hovering above the battlefield, in clear view of both armies, could not be dismissed. The sight of Necron nobility directing the fighting from their command barge often breaking enemy morale more effectively than any weapon. Human soldiers watching an overlord calmly surveying the destruction of their forces, while standing completely exposed, understood that they faced an enemy who possessed such confidence in their superiority that they didn't even bother seeking cover. The Annihilation Barge provided overlords with mobile fire support that could engage multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining the mobility necessary to keep pace with advancing forces. These vehicles mounted Tesla destructors that fired lightning-like discharges, the weapon's energy arcing between targets to engage entire enemy formations with single shots. The Tesla technology proved particularly effective against infantry formations, the electrical discharges jumping from soldier to soldier and incapacitating dozens of enemies with each firing sequence. The barge's anti-gravity systems allowed it to maintain position above Necron advance lines, the vehicle's weapons providing suppressing fire that kept enemy forces pinned, while warriors and immortals closed to optimal Gauss weapon range. Overlords commanding Annihilation barges coordinated their vehicles' fire with the movements of ground forces, their tactical awareness ensuring that Tesla strikes hit enemy positions moments before Necron phalanxes arrived to exploit the disruption. The monoliths represented the ultimate expression of Necron military engineering available to overlords, these massive constructs serving as mobile fortresses that combined devastating firepower with troop transport capabilities. The floating pyramids stood dozens of meters tall, their necrodermis hulls reinforced to withstand punishment that would destroy conventional vehicles. The particle whip mounted atop each monolith fired energy discharges that could annihilate entire enemy formations, the weapon drawing power directly from the construct's massive reactor core to generate shots of apocalyptic destructive potential. The Gauss flux arcs positioned around the monolith's base swept the surrounding area clear of enemies, the weapons firing automatically at any target that approached within their effective range. The Eternity Gate built into one face of the monolith provided a translocation portal that connected directly to the Tomb World's dimensional corridors, allowing the Overlord to deploy reinforcements directly onto the battlefield, regardless of distance or intervening obstacles. The tactical flexibility monoliths provided made them centerpieces of Overlord battle plans during major engagements. The construct could advance at the forefront of Necron lines, its weapons clearing paths through enemy defenses, while its hull absorbed fire that would have destroyed lesser vehicles. Warriors and immortals deployed through the Eternity Gate emerged directly into combat, their forces materializing in positions that would have required hours or days to reach through conventional movement. The monolith's presence on the battlefield served as both weapon and symbol, its massive form demonstrating the Overlord's power and the resources they commanded. Enemy forces that witnessed monoliths advancing toward their positions understood they faced technology that exceeded anything their own civilizations had produced, the psychological impact often breaking resistance before the constructs even engaged with their weapons. The obelisks that some overlords deployed represented even more specialized assets, these constructs mounting tesseract labyrinths that contained captured Khatan shards. The imprisoned star god fragments provided devastating offensive capabilities that warped reality itself when released in controlled bursts. An overlord commanding an obelisk could unleash temporal distortions that aged enemy forces into dust within seconds, spatial warps that compressed entire formations into singularities, or energy discharges that burned with the fury of dying stars. The risks involved in deploying Khatan shards made obelisks rare even among overlord assets, the star god fragments constantly seeking opportunities to escape their imprisonment and wreak havoc on whatever forces stood nearby regardless of allegiance. The cryptechs who maintained these constructs worked continuously to reinforce the containment systems and ensure the shards remained under control, their expertise representing the only barrier between controlled weapon and catastrophic failure. The reliance overlords placed on cryptech specialists for technological support created relationships that balanced authority with dependency. The overlord commanded absolute obedience from their cryptechs through hierarchical protocols, but they also recognized that these specialists possessed knowledge and capabilities that made them irreplaceable. A plasmancer who wielded solar fire could turn the tide of battles through their mastery of stellar energies, their weapons channeling power that exceeded conventional Necron armaments by orders of magnitude. These cryptechs studied the fundamental forces that govern stars, their research allowing them to manipulate plasma states with precision that made them living artillery pieces. An overlord commanding a plasmancer could call down solar flares on enemy positions, the specialist directing energies that vaporized everything within the target area and left behind molten craters that glowed with residual heat for days afterward. The chronomancers who served overlord courts manipulated temporal fields through technologies that bordered on incomprehensible, even to other Necrons. These specialists could slow time within localized areas, creating bubbles where enemy movements became glacial while Necron forces operated at normal speed. The tactical advantages this provided were obvious. Necron warriors advancing through slowed time zones could close to optimal firing range, while enemy defenders struggled to track targets that moved at seemingly impossible speeds from their distorted temporal perspective. Chronomancers could also accelerate time around damaged warriors, allowing reanimation protocols to complete in seconds rather than the minutes they would normally require. The most skilled practitioners created temporal loops that trapped enemies in repeating moments, their consciousness experiencing the same instant over and over while their bodies remained frozen in space, unable to act or escape. The psychomancers represented specialists who studied organic psychology and developed weapons that attacked the mind rather than the body. These cryptechs understood that species with biological brains remained vulnerable to induced terror, madness, and despair in ways that Necrons with their mechanical consciousness could not experience. The device's psychomancers created broadcast neural patterns designed to trigger primal fears embedded in organic psychology, their signals inducing panic responses that overwhelmed rational thought. Human soldiers exposed to psychomancer weapons found themselves paralyzed by terror that had no logical source, their minds convinced they faced threats that didn't actually exist. The specialists could also induce hallucinations that made enemies perceive their allies as threats, turning organized military units into confused mobs that fired on each other. Overlords deployed psychomancers against enemies whose morale represented a critical weakness, the specialists breaking the will to fight before conventional forces needed to engage. The technomancers who maintained the Overlord's military assets possessed expertise that extended across every weapon system and vehicle in the dynasty's arsenal. These specialists supervised the canoptech constructs that performed routine maintenance, but they personally attended to the most critical systems and sophisticated technologies. A technomancer ensured that doomsday arcs maintained optimal firing calibration, that monolith eternity gates remained synchronized with tomb world translocation matrices, and that Gauss weaponry functioned within acceptable parameters. Their eldritch lances served dual purposes as both weapons and tools, the devices capable of firing destructive energy beams in combat, while also functioning as repair implements that could restore damaged necrodermis or reanimate warriors whose reanimation protocols had failed. Technomancers accompanied Overlord forces during campaigns, their presence ensuring that battle damage could be addressed immediately rather than requiring units to withdraw to Tomb World facilities for repairs. The integration of these various cryptech disciplines into Overlord battle plans created combined arms approaches that leveraged each specialist's unique capabilities. An Overlord planning an assault might position plasmancers to bombard enemy fortifications with solar fire, while chronomancers created temporal acceleration zones that allowed Necron forces to advance at speeds the defenders couldn't track. Psychomancers would broadcast terror-inducing patterns that broke enemy morale moments before warriors opened fire with their Gauss flares. The combination of psychological attack and physical assault overwhelming defenders who might have held against either threat individually. Technomancers maintained position behind the advance lines, their consciousness monitoring the status of every Necron unit and dispatching canoptech constructs to address damage as it occurred. The command networks that linked overlords to their cryptech specialists functioned through quantum entanglement communication systems that provided instantaneous coordination regardless of distance or interference. The Overlord's consciousness maintained constant awareness of each specialist's status and capabilities, their tactical subroutines automatically incorporating cryptech assets into battle plans as situations developed. A plasmancer detecting a concentration of enemy armor would transmit targeting data directly to the Overlord's consciousness, the information appearing in their awareness as clearly as their own sensor feeds. The Overlord would evaluate the threat, calculate the optimal response, and issue commands that the plasmancer received and executed within microseconds of the initial detection. This level of coordination made Necron forces commanded by overlords with full cryptech support devastatingly effective, their operations unfolding with precision that organic armies struggling with conventional communication delays couldn't match. The technological superiority these weapons and systems provided did not guarantee victory in every engagement, as the overlords discovered when facing enemies who possessed their own sophisticated capabilities or overwhelming numerical advantages. Human space marines equipped with power armor and wielding bolters that fired mass reactive shells could withstand Gauss fire long enough to close to ranges where their superior close combat abilities gave them advantages. Ildari forces using webway portals could appear anywhere on the battlefield, their mobility allowing them to strike at cryptech specialists before Necron forces could respond. Orc hordes numbering in the millions could simply absorb casualties that would break any other species, their crude weapons and savage melee attacks eventually overwhelming even Necron reanimation protocols through sheer weight of numbers. The overlords adapted their tactics to account for these challenges, their strategic genius finding ways to leverage their technological advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy strengths. The overlords who emerged from the Great Sleep discovered that reclaiming their ancient empire would require campaigns of systematic extermination that dwarfed even the conflicts of the War in Heaven in their scope and brutality. The younger races had spread across worlds the Necrons considered sovereign territory, their populations numbering in the trillions and their civilizations controlling resources on scales that individual tomb worlds could not match through military force alone. The strategic calculations performed by awakening overlords revealed uncomfortable truths about their species situation. The finite number of Necron warriors available meant that every destroyed unit represented an irreplaceable loss, while the organic species could reproduce and replace casualties at rates that exceeded Necron reanimation capabilities when measured across entire populations. The overlords adapted their strategies to account for these realities, developing approaches to conquest that emphasized efficiency over speed and technological superiority over numerical advantage. The reclamation of tomb worlds formed the first priority for every awakening overlord, these campaigns representing the foundation upon which all future expansion would build. The organic populations that had settled on Necron territories during the 60 million year slumber had no concept of the ancient claims their presence violated, their civilizations having developed on worlds they considered unclaimed and available for colonization. The overlords cared nothing for these ignorant trespasses or the civilizations that had committed them. The presence of organic life on tomb worlds represented contamination that required immediate cleansing, the younger race's cities and populations' obstacles to be eliminated before the serious work of dynastic restoration could begin. The initial strikes against surface populations proceeded with mechanical efficiency as overlords activated their military forces and directed them upward through kilometers of planetary crust to emerge in the midst of settlements that had no warning of the threat rising beneath them. The human colonies that fell to these first assaults discovered the fundamental difference between Necron warfare and the conflicts they had experienced against other species. The orcs who raided human worlds sought plunder and battle, their attacks chaotic but ultimately survivable for populations that could mount effective resistance. The Eldari who struck from the webway pursued specific objectives, their raids targeting particular individuals or artifacts before withdrawing, rather than attempting total conquest. The Necrons who erupted from beneath the ground came to exterminate every living thing on the planet, their advance implacable, and their objectives non-negotiable. Gauss flayers stripped human defenders apart at the molecular level, while Ghost Arcs maintained reanimation protocols that returned destroyed warriors to combat within minutes. The human soldiers who fought these initial engagements watched their most effective weapons achieve nothing permanent, the Necron forces they managed to damage or destroy simply phasing back into existence to continue their advance. The Overlords directing these cleansing operations employed tactics refined during millions of years of warfare against enemies far more sophisticated than the humans they now faced. They identified critical infrastructure that sustained the human populations and targeted these systems with precision strikes that collapsed entire settlement networks. Power generation facilities fell to Doomsday Arc bombardment, the quantum beams reducing fusion reactors to craters that glowed with residual radiation. Water purification plants received visits from Deathmark squads that phased in from dimensional pockets to eliminate the facility's control systems before phasing out again. Communications networks went dark as Canoptech wraiths infiltrated transmission stations and tore apart the equipment that allowed human defenders to coordinate their resistance. The systematic destruction of infrastructure transformed human colonies from organized civilizations into scattered groups of survivors whose ability to mount coordinated resistance had been eliminated before they fully understood what was happening. The restoration of Crown Worlds represented objectives that transcended simple territorial reclamation, these planets having served as the seats of dynastic power during the Necrontyr era. The Overlords who ruled these worlds before the Great Sleep awakened to find their former capitals occupied by civilizations that had built entire cultures atop ruins they didn't recognize as artificial. Human hive cities rose from foundations that had been Necrontyr palaces, their populations numbering in the billions and their industrial output sustaining entire sectors of the Imperium. Orc empires had claimed other crown worlds, the Greenskins' ramshackle cities spreading across surfaces that had once hosted the most sophisticated architecture the Necrontyr had produced. The Overlords viewed these developments with the same emotional response they brought to all situations in their mechanical existence, which is to say none at all, but their strategic imperatives regarding Crownworld restoration remained absolute regardless of the obstacles involved. The campaigns to reclaim Crownworlds required resources that exceeded what single Tomb Worlds could provide, forcing Overlords to coordinate their efforts and pool their military strength. The Pharaon Emotic directed multiple subordinate Overlords to concentrate their forces for the assault on the Crownworld Davatas, the planet having served as a major administrative center for the Sodic dynasty during the Necrontyr era. The human hive cities that now covered Davatas housed a population exceeding 20 billion, their industrial complexes producing war materiel for Imperial Guard regiments across the sector. The Sotek forces that emerged from hidden tomb complexes numbered in the tens of millions, their legions coordinated through command networks that allowed Emotic to direct the entire campaign from his throne on Mandragora. The assault proceeded in phases calculated to maximize efficiency while minimizing Necron casualties, the Overlords understanding that while their warriors would eventually reanimate, the time required for reconstruction represented a tactical disadvantage that careful planning could mitigate. The strategic objectives Overlords pursued when dealing with organic populations varied based on the specific circumstances of each situation and the resources available to address them. The default approach involved complete extermination, the systematic elimination of every organic being on the target world through military force that left no survivors and no possibility of the species returning. Overlords directing these extermination campaigns deployed their forces to sweep across entire continents, their warriors advancing in phalanxes that left nothing living in their wake. Deathmarks hunted survivors who fled into wilderness areas, the specialized Necrons phasing in to eliminate targets that conventional forces might miss. Canoptech constructs scoured the cleansed territories for any remaining organic contamination, their sensors detecting life signs that even sophisticated hiding places couldn't mask. The thoroughness of these operations ensured that worlds subjected to Necron extermination protocols became lifeless rocks, where nothing remained but ruins and the scattered remains of civilizations that had ceased to exist. Some overlords recognized that certain organic populations possessed value that made their immediate extermination wasteful, these nobles calculating that temporary preservation served dynastic interests better than reflexive slaughter. Mining colonies that had extracted valuable resources during the Necrons' absence represented infrastructure that could be exploited before being discarded. The overlords enslaved these populations through mind-shackle scarabs and neural control systems, their consciousness overridden to make them compliant workers who continued their extraction operations under Necron supervision. The resources these enslaved populations produced flowed to tomb world manufacturing facilities, where they sustained the production of new weapons and the maintenance of existing military assets. The organic workers who performed this labor understood their situation with whatever awareness the control systems allowed them to retain, their consciousness trapped in bodies that obeyed commands they couldn't resist, while they watched their own hands serve the species that had conquered them. The study of organic populations represented another category of interaction that certain overlords pursued, their consciousness retaining enough scientific curiosity to find value in observing the younger races. The cryptechs who served these nobles conducted experiments that ranged from simple biological analysis to complex psychological studies that tested organic responses to various stimuli. Human subjects found themselves trapped in testing facilities where Necron specialists measured their reactions to fear, pain, sensory deprivation, and conditions designed to push organic consciousness to its breaking points. The data collected through these experiments informed psychomancer weapon development and provided insights into organic psychology that improved Necron tactical approaches. The test subjects rarely survived the research, their bodies and minds pushed beyond tolerances that organic biology could sustain, but the overlords who authorized these studies considered the knowledge gained worth whatever suffering the process inflicted. The manipulation of organic populations through indirect means appealed to overlords whose strategic thinking extended beyond simple military conquest. These nobles recognized that the younger races could be turned against each other through careful intervention, their conflicts consuming resources and attention that might otherwise be directed toward resisting Necron expansion. The Overlord Trazyn deployed Mindshackle Scarab-controlled agents into human command structures. These possessed individuals issuing orders that redirected Imperial military forces away from Necron territories and toward conflicts with other species. The manipulated commanders appeared to function normally, their behavior showing no obvious signs of external control, while they pursued objectives that served Necron interests rather than Imperial ones. Other overlords seeded false intelligence that provoked conflicts between human factions, their carefully crafted misinformation triggering civil wars that weakened the Imperium's ability to respond to Necron threats. The conflicts with the Imperium of Man represented the most significant military challenges facing awakening overlords, the human empire's vast territories and massive military forces, making it the primary obstacle to Necron resurgence. The Orphean War demonstrated the scale of commitment required to conquer territories the Imperium considered strategically valuable, the campaign consuming decades and involving hundreds of tomb worlds coordinating their efforts against human defenders who fought with determination that impressed even Necron observers. The overlords who commanded Necron forces during the Orphean War discovered that humans possessed military doctrines developed over 10,000 years of constant warfare, their tactics incorporating lessons learned from conflicts against every major threat the galaxy had produced. Imperial Guard regiments dug defensive positions that channeled Necron advances into killing zones, where concentrated fire could overwhelm even reanimation protocols. Space Marine strike forces identified Necron command nodes and attacked them directly, their assault squads teleporting into Overlord positions to eliminate commanders whose destruction disrupted entire battle plans. The Damnos campaign brought Necron forces into direct conflict with the Ultramarines, the encounter revealing both the capabilities and limitations of Space Marine warfare when facing an enemy that refused to stay dead. The Overlords commanding the Damnos tomb worlds coordinated their awakening to coincide with the planet's strategic value to the Imperium, their timing ensuring that human defenders would commit significant resources to holding territory the Necrons intended to reclaim. The Ultramarines who responded to the Damnos situation brought tactical expertise that exceeded standard Imperial Guard capabilities, their centuries of experience and enhanced physiology making them far more dangerous opponents than baseline human soldiers. The Space Marines adapted to Necron reanimation protocols faster than conventional forces, their sergeants identifying the pattern of warrior reconstruction and directing their squads to focus fire that destroyed Necron units faster than they could phase back into existence. The Overlord who ruled Damnos employed counter-tactics specifically designed to neutralize Space Marine advantages, his strategic analysis identifying vulnerabilities in their approach that conventional human forces lacked the capability to exploit. The Necron forces concentrated their attacks on isolated Space Marine squads, their numerical superiority allowing them to achieve local overwhelming force that even enhanced Astartes' physiology couldn't withstand. Lychguard units engaged Space Marine assault squads in close combat where their warscythes could negate the advantage of power armor, the phase weapons passing through ceramite to strike the warriors within. The campaign ground on for months as both sides adapted their tactics in response to enemy innovations, the conflict demonstrating that while Space Marines represented formidable opponents, they remained vulnerable to enemies who could match their tactical sophistication and exceed their numbers. The Cryptus campaign expanded across multiple star systems as Necron forces pushed outward from awakened tomb worlds to establish buffer zones around their core territories. The Overlords directing this expansion recognized that controlling the space surrounding their tomb worlds mattered as much as holding the planets themselves, their strategic vision encompassing defensive depth that would prevent enemies from threatening their primary installations. The campaign brought Necron forces into conflict with Tyranid hive fleets, whose arrival in the region coincided with the tomb world's awakening, the timing suggesting either remarkable coincidence or some factor that drew both species to the same territories. The Overlords analyzed the Tyranids with interest that approached concern, their consciousness recognizing in these creatures a threat that differed fundamentally from other organic species they had encountered. The Tyranids consumed everything organic they encountered, their hive fleets stripping worlds of all biological matter and leaving behind lifeless rocks that resembled the results of Necron extermination campaigns. The Overlords calculated that while Tyranids posed no direct threat to Necron existence, their consumption of organic populations represented a strategic problem. The younger races that the Necrons intended to conquer or exploit were being devoured by an enemy that showed no interest in negotiation or manipulation. The biomass that Tyranids consumed could not be recovered or repurposed. The organic matter transformed into more Tyranid organisms that continued the cycle of consumption. The Overlords directing forces against Tyranid incursions discovered that conventional Necron tactics required modification when facing an enemy that felt no fear, showed no concern for casualties, and adapted to threats with disturbing speed. The Pariah Nexus represented the most ambitious Necron expansion project undertaken since the Awakening began, the campaign involving coordination between multiple dynasties and the deployment of technologies that affected entire sectors of space. The Overlords who conceived the Pariah Nexus recognized that controlling territory required more than military conquest, their strategic vision encompassing the transformation of real space itself to make it inhospitable to species that relied on warp-based technologies. The pylons deployed throughout the Nexus generated fields that suppressed warp phenomena, their combined effect creating zones, where psychers found their powers failing and warp travel became impossible. The technology drew on knowledge preserved from the war in heaven. The pylons representing refinements of weapons the Necrons had developed to counter the Old One's mastery of the immaterium. The expansion of the Pariah Nexus proceeded through systematic conquest of worlds that occupied strategic positions within the target region, the Overlords calculating optimal pylon placement to maximize the anti-warp effect while minimizing the resources required for deployment and defense. Human populations caught within the expanding Nexus discovered that the Astronomican's light no longer reached them, their navigators unable to perceive the psychic beacon that made warp travel possible across the Imperium. Worlds that had been integrated into the Imperial economy through regular trade and military support found themselves isolated as warp routes that had functioned for millennia became impassable. The Overlords exploited this isolation to conquer systems that could no longer call for reinforcements, their forces overwhelming defenders who fought alone against enemies that could coordinate across the entire Nexus through non-warp communication systems. The inter-dynasty warfare that erupted as Tomb Worlds awakened demonstrated that 60 million years of stasis had not resolved the territorial disputes and ancient grudges that had plagued the Necrons since the Necron-tier era. Overlords who had competed for territory before the Great Sleep discovered that their rivals had also survived the long dormancy, their consciousness preserving the details of conflicts that had never been resolved. The borders that had separated dynasties during the Necron-tier era bore no relationship to the actual distribution of awakened Tomb Worlds, the random nature of Great Sleep survival meaning that ancient territorial claims overlapped in ways that made conflict inevitable. Some Overlords awakened to find their traditional territories now occupied by Tomb Worlds belonging to dynasties they had fought during the War in Heaven, the situation creating immediate tensions that often escalated into open warfare. The conflict between the Sodek dynasty and the Mefrit dynasty over control of the Sanctum system exemplified the challenges inter-dynasty disputes created for the broader Necron species. Both dynasties claimed Sanctum based on ancient territorial agreements that contradicted each other, their archives preserving different versions of treaties that had been negotiated before biotransference. The Overlords who commanded forces in the Sanctum system found themselves fighting other Necrons rather than the organic populations both dynasties agreed represented threats requiring elimination. The engagement demonstrated the fundamental problem with Necron inter-dynasty conflict. Neither side could achieve decisive victory through conventional military means because both employed identical technologies and tactics. The battles devolved into grinding attritional warfare, where reanimation protocols on both sides meant that victories measured in destroyed units became meaningless when those same units phased back into existence to continue fighting. The pharaons who ruled these competing dynasties recognized that inter-dynasty warfare consumed resources that could be directed toward conquering the younger races, but their consciousness remained bound by hierarchical protocols and ancient oaths that made certain territorial claims non-negotiable. The Silent King's absence meant that no authority existed that could compel dynasties to accept arbitrated settlements, the Triarch having dissolved when Zarek departed the galaxy after the rebellion against the Khatan. Individual overlords sometimes pursued agendas that conflicted with their pharaoh's stated objectives, their damaged consciousness or personal ambitions leading them to initiate conflicts their superiors had not authorized. These rogue operations created diplomatic complications that forced pharaohs to either support subordinates, whose actions they hadn't approved, or discipline overlords, whose consciousness might be too degraded to understand why their behavior was problematic. The competition for resources that had survived the Great Sleep drove conflicts that transcended simple territorial disputes. Certain Tomb Worlds had awakened with their manufacturing facilities intact and their resource stockpiles preserved, making them valuable prizes that could significantly enhance any dynasty's military capabilities. The overlords who controlled these resource-rich worlds found themselves targeted by rivals who calculated that conquest would cost fewer resources than developing equivalent capabilities independently. The attacks on these worlds sometimes involved temporary alliances between dynasties that normally competed with each other, their overlords coordinating assaults against common targets before returning to their own territorial disputes once the immediate objective had been achieved. The Great Rift tore reality itself apart in the closing years of the 41st millennium. The massive warp storm, designated as the Cicatrix Maledictum, splitting the galaxy into two distinct regions that could no longer maintain reliable contact with each other. The overlords who had awakened before this catastrophic event detected the psychic turbulence through sensor systems designed to monitor warp phenomena, their instruments registering disruptions on scales that exceeded anything recorded since the War in Heaven. The storm's expansion consumed entire sectors, its boundaries marked by regions where real space and the immaterium bled together in ways that made conventional physics meaningless. The younger races that relied on warp travel found their civilizations fragmenting as the Great Rift severed communication and transportation routes that had functioned for millennia, their empires suddenly unable to coordinate across distances that had previously presented no obstacle. The overlords calculated that this catastrophe should have represented an unmitigated disaster for species dependent on warp-based technologies, yet their analysis revealed unexpected complications that affected Necron interests directly. The psychic energies unleashed by the Great Rift's formation propagated through the galaxy in waves that interacted with Tomb World stasis systems in ways the ancient Necron-tier engineers had never anticipated. The fields that maintained Necron dormancy relied on technologies that manipulated dimensional states adjacent to real space, their function requiring precise calibration to prevent interference from external energy sources. The massive psychic disruption caused by the Cicatrix Maledictum overwhelmed these calibrations across hundreds of Tomb Worlds simultaneously, their stasis systems destabilizing as warp energies flooded through dimensional barriers that should have remained impermeable. The accelerated awakening that resulted brought entire dynasties back from dormancy decades or centuries ahead of their programmed revival schedules. The overlords who emerged from this premature awakening discovered their consciousness returning under conditions their reanimation protocols had not been designed to handle, the process rushing through stages that should have taken hours or days, but instead completed in minutes. Some nobles experienced this forced revival with their engram matrices intact, their awareness snapping back to full functionality despite the irregular circumstances. Others suffered additional degradation as the rushed process corrupted data that might have survived a properly executed awakening sequence, their consciousness emerging damaged in ways that added to whatever harm the Great Sleep had already inflicted. The Tomb Worlds themselves showed signs of stress from the premature activation, their power systems struggling to provide energy to complexes that had expected to remain dormant for significantly longer periods. The strategic situation these newly awakened overlords found themselves facing differed dramatically from what their predecessors had encountered. The Imperium of Man had fragmented into two regions designated Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus, the division created by the Great Rift separating the territories that maintained contact with Terra from those cut off from the Astronomican's light. The overlords who awakened in Imperium Nihilus discovered human populations struggling to maintain their civilizations without the psychic beacon that had guided their warp travel for 10,000 years. These isolated human worlds presented opportunities that the overlords exploited with mechanical efficiency, their forces conquering systems that could no longer call for reinforcements from the broader Imperium. The campaigns proceeded faster than similar operations in Imperium Sanctus, the human defenders lacking the coordinated support that had made earlier Necron conquests so costly in terms of time and resources. The Primaris Space Marines that appeared across the galaxy represented a development that forced overlords to recalculate their tactical assessments of Astartes' capabilities. These enhanced warriors stood taller than their predecessors and demonstrated physical capabilities that exceeded even the already formidable baseline Space Marines. The Overlords who encountered Primaris forces in combat discovered that these new warriors required adjusted tactics to engage effectively. Their enhanced durability and improved weapons, making them more dangerous opponents than the Space Marines that Necron forces had fought during earlier campaigns. The Gauss weapons that could reliably eliminate baseline Astartes sometimes proved insufficient against Primaris physiology, their enhanced organs and reinforced bone structure allowing them to survive hits that would have killed their predecessors. The Overlords adapted by concentrating fire and deploying heavier weapons against Primaris units, their tactical subroutines updating to account for the new threat parameters these warriors represented. The return of Zarek, the Silent King, to the galaxy after 60 million years of self-imposed exile created political complications that reverberated through every awakened dynasty. The former ruler of the Triarch had departed after the rebellion against the Khatan, his consciousness unable to bear remaining among the species he had condemned to biotransference through his acceptance of the Star God's offer. Zarek had traveled beyond the galaxy's edge, his journey taking him into the intergalactic void, where he searched for solutions to the fundamental problem of Necron existence. The Silent King returned with warnings about threats he had encountered in the darkness between galaxies, his consciousness carrying knowledge of the Tyranid hive fleets whose approach toward the galaxy represented an existential danger to all species, including the Necrons themselves. The call for unity that Zarek broadcast to the dynasties appealed to strategic logic that every Overlord could comprehend regardless of their personal ambitions or territorial disputes. The Tyranids consumed all organic matter they encountered, their hive fleets stripping worlds of biomass that the Necrons might otherwise exploit or study. The younger races that the Overlords intended to conquer or manipulate were being devoured by an enemy that showed no interest in anything except feeding. The Silent King argued that the Necrons faced a choice between uniting to confront this threat or watching the galaxy become a lifeless wasteland where nothing remained but Tyranid organisms and the Necrons themselves, locked in eternal conflict over territories that held no value because every other form of life had been consumed. The logic was sound, but Zarek's authority to compel obedience had dissolved when the Triarch ended, making his call for unity a request rather than a command that hierarchical protocols would enforce. The responses from individual Overlords and their Pharaons varied based on their personalities, their strategic assessments, and the degree to which their consciousness had degraded during the Great Sleep. Imodic the Stormlord acknowledged Zarek's warnings about the Tyranid threat, while simultaneously rejecting the Silent King's claim to authority over the Sodek dynasty. The Pharaon's strategic analysis confirmed that the Tyranids represented a significant danger, but his consciousness retained enough independence to resist subordinating Sodek interests to Zarek's broader objectives. Imodic committed forces to operations against Tyranid hive fleets when those conflicts aligned with Sodek territorial ambitions, his warriors engaging the bioorganisms in battles that served dual purposes of eliminating the Xenos threat while expanding the dynasty's influence. The Stormlord refused to acknowledge Zarek as supreme commander of all Necron forces, his hierarchical protocols recognizing no authority above his own within Sodek territories. Other Overlords responded to Zarek's return with varying degrees of enthusiasm or hostility. Some Pharaons whose dynasties had maintained close ties to the Triarch during the Necrontyr era found their hierarchical protocols compelling them to acknowledge the Silent King's authority, their consciousness recognizing command codes that predated biotransference and had survived the Great Sleep intact. These nobles coordinated their campaigns with Zarek's broader strategic objectives, their forces operating as components of a unified Necron response to the Tyranid threat. The Overlords who served these cooperative Pharaons discovered that participating in Silent King-directed operations provided access to resources and intelligence that exceeded what their individual dynasties could gather independently, the coordination allowing them to achieve objectives that would have been impossible through isolated action. The overlords whose consciousness had suffered severe degradation during the Great Sleep often proved incapable of comprehending Zarek's arguments about long-term species survival. These damaged nobles pursued objectives that made sense only to their corrupted engram matrices, their campaigns following logic that other Necrons struggled to understand. Some attacked forces that Zarek had identified as potential allies against the Tyranids, their consciousness unable to distinguish between different categories of organic species or to calculate the strategic value of temporary cooperation. Others ignored the Tyranid threat entirely, their awareness so compromised that they couldn't process information about dangers that didn't present immediate tactical challenges to their own territories. The Silent King's attempts to coordinate these damaged overlords met with limited success, their corrupted consciousness making them unreliable allies whose actions sometimes contradicted broader strategic objectives. The Pariah Nexus expansion accelerated after the Great Rift's formation, the overlords who directed this project recognizing that the psychic disruption created by the Cicatrix Maledictum made their anti-warp technologies more valuable than ever. The pylons that generated null zones suppressing chaos and psyker abilities represented weapons that could counter the warp-based threats proliferating across the galaxy. The demons that poured through tears in reality found themselves weakening as they approached pylon-protected territories, their forms destabilizing as the null fields disrupted the warp energies that sustained their existence in real space. The human psychers whose abilities had made them valuable assets to the Imperium discovered their powers failing within the Pariah Nexus, their consciousness unable to access the immaterium through barriers the pylons created. The strategic vision behind the Pariah Nexus expansion encompassed more than simple territorial conquest. The overlords who coordinated pylon deployment calculated that controlling sufficient territory with overlapping null fields could create regions of space where warp-based civilizations simply could not function. The Imperium relied on psychers for communication, navigation, and military capabilities that would become impossible within properly established null zones. The Eldari, whose entire civilization depended on psychic abilities, would find their technologies failing and their warriors powerless. Even the Tyranids, whose hive mind coordinated through psychic connections, would suffer disruption as the null fields interfered with the synapse creatures that directed lesser organisms. The overlords envisioned a galaxy transformed into a realm where only the Necrons could operate effectively, their non-warp technologies functioning normally while every other species struggled with capabilities that had suddenly become unreliable or completely non-functional. The expansion required resources that exceeded what individual dynasties could provide, forcing unprecedented cooperation between overlords who had spent the entire period since awakening competing with each other. The manufacturing of pylons demanded materials and expertise that only the most intact tomb worlds possessed, their facilities having survived the Great Sleep with the capabilities needed to produce the sophisticated technologies. The deployment of these pylons across multiple star systems required military forces capable of conquering and holding territories against enemies who recognized the strategic threat the null fields represented. The coordination necessary to achieve optimal pylon placement and overlapping field coverage demanded communication and planning between dynasties that had historically viewed each other as rivals. The overlords involved in the Pariah Nexus project discovered that cooperation, while contrary to their territorial instincts, produced results that justified setting aside traditional competitive behaviors. The resistance the younger races mounted against Pariah Nexus expansion demonstrated that they understood the existential threat these null zones represented to their civilizations. The Imperium committed significant military resources to assaulting pylon installations, their forces recognizing that allowing the Necrons to establish permanent null fields would make entire sectors ungovernable through conventional Imperial administration. Space Marine strike forces targeted pylon sites with precision assaults designed to destroy the installations before Necron defenders could respond effectively. Imperial Guard regiments besieged worlds where pylons had been deployed, their commanders accepting casualties that would normally be considered unacceptable because the strategic importance of preventing null field expansion justified any cost. The Eldari launched their own operations against pylon networks, their farseers having perceived futures where the expansion of null zones led to the complete collapse of their civilization. The ultimate goal that drove certain overlords transcended territorial conquest or military dominance. Their consciousness focused on the possibility of reversing biotransference and reclaiming the organic existence that the Khatan had stolen. These nobles recognized that their species faced a fundamental problem that no amount of military success could solve. The Necrons existed as consciousness trapped in necrodermis shells, their awareness preserved, but their ability to truly live destroyed by the transformation that had granted them immortality. The sensations, emotions, and experiences that defined organic existence remained forever beyond their reach, their mechanical bodies providing data but no genuine feeling. Some overlords accepted this reality as permanent, their consciousness adapting to existence without sensation, by focusing entirely on objectives that mechanical minds could pursue. Others refused to accept that their condition was irreversible, their engram matrices retaining enough of their original personality to drive research into possibilities that most Necrons considered impossible. The secret facilities where this research occurred remained hidden from the broader dynasties, the overlords who authorized these experiments understanding that their activities would be viewed with suspicion or outright hostility by nobles who had accepted their mechanical existence. The cryptex who conducted this research worked with resources that included captured specimens from multiple organic species, their laboratories containing humans, Eldari, orcs, and representatives of dozens of other races. The experiments tested whether Necron consciousness could be transferred into organic bodies, the research building on technologies developed during the original biotransference, but attempting to reverse the process rather than complete it. The initial attempts failed catastrophically, the organic brains unable to accommodate consciousness that had been formatted for necrodermis matrices, the test subjects dying as their neural tissue burned out under the strain of hosting awareness designed for mechanical systems. The cryptex refined their approaches through iterations that consumed hundreds of test subjects, their research identifying the specific incompatibilities that prevented successful consciousness transfer. The organic brains lacked the processing capacity that necrodermis matrices provided, their neural architecture unable to support the enhanced awareness that Necron consciousness had developed during millions of years in mechanical bodies. The solution required either enhancing organic brains to match necrodermis capabilities or simplifying Necron consciousness to fit within biological constraints. Both approaches presented challenges that pushed the boundaries of what even Necron technology could achieve. The enhancement of organic brains required modifications so extensive that the resulting tissue barely qualified as biological, the augmentations transforming neural matter into hybrid systems that combined organic and mechanical components. The simplification of Necron consciousness risked losing the very awareness that made the overlords who they were, their personalities potentially degrading to the point where the consciousness that transferred into organic bodies would no longer be the same individual who had authorized the experiment. The experiments with hybrid bodies represented attempts to find middle ground between fully organic and completely mechanical existence. The cryptex created vessels that combined organic tissue with necrodermis support structures, their designs attempting to provide both the sensory capabilities of biological bodies and the durability of mechanical frames. These hybrid forms incorporated organic nervous systems that could process sensory input and generate the neural patterns associated with emotion and sensation, while necrodermis components provided structural support and housed the consciousness matrices that contained Necron awareness. The test subjects who received consciousness transfers into these hybrid bodies reported experiences that suggested partial success, their awareness registering sensations that necrodermis frames could not provide, while maintaining the enhanced processing capabilities their mechanical existence had granted them. The limitations these hybrid forms demonstrated revealed fundamental problems with the entire approach to reversing biotransference. The organic components required constant maintenance to prevent rejection of the mechanical elements, their immune systems recognizing necrodermis as foreign material and attacking the interfaces between biological and artificial tissue. The sensations the hybrid bodies provided remained muted compared to what fully organic beings experienced. The neural pathways connecting organic nervous systems to mechanical consciousness matrices, introducing delays and distortions that prevented true feeling. The overlords who underwent experimental transfers into hybrid bodies discovered that while they could perceive sensations their necrodermis forms could not detect, the experience fell far short of the organic existence they remembered from before biotransference. The disappointment these experiments generated led some overlords to conclude that true reversal of biotransference remained impossible, the transformation that had made them immortal having destroyed something fundamental that could never be recovered. The discovery of human blanks and the pariah gene represented a development that certain cryptechs believed might provide solutions to the biotransference reversal problem. These soulless humans existed outside the warp in ways that resembled Necron existence, their consciousness functioning without the spiritual component that connected other organic beings to the immaterium. The overlords who learned about pariahs calculated that bodies built from this template might be more compatible with Necron consciousness than standard organic forms, their lack of warp presence potentially making them suitable vessels for awareness that had been stripped of its spiritual component during biotransference. The research into this possibility remained in early stages, the scarcity of pariah specimens making extensive experimentation difficult, but the theoretical potential drove some overlords to commit significant resources to acquiring test subjects and developing the technologies necessary to attempt consciousness transfer into soulless organic bodies. The question of whether the Necrons could ever truly reclaim what they had lost to the Khatan's deception remained unanswered as the era Indomitus progressed. The overlords who pursued biotransference reversal understood that even if they achieved technical success in transferring consciousness into organic bodies, they faced a philosophical problem that technology could not solve. The beings who had been Necron tier no longer existed in any meaningful sense, their souls consumed by the Khatan during the transformation that had created the Necrons. The consciousness that survived in necrodermis matrices represented copies or echoes of what those beings had been, their awareness preserved, but the fundamental spark that had made them truly alive destroyed permanently. Creating new organic bodies and transferring Necron consciousness into them would not restore what had been lost. It would merely create new beings that combined mechanical awareness with biological form without recovering the souls that had defined the original Necron tier as living creatures. The overlords confronted this reality with responses that varied based on their preserved personalities and the degree to which their consciousness retained the capacity for what might be called despair. Some concluded that the pursuit of biotransference reversal represented a futile attempt to reclaim something that could never be recovered, their awareness accepting that they would exist as mechanical beings until their necrodermis frames finally degraded beyond repair or some enemy achieved their permanent destruction. These nobles focused their attention on objectives that mechanical consciousness could pursue, their campaigns of conquest and territorial expansion providing purpose that did not require the sensations or emotions they could no longer experience. Others refused to accept that their condition was permanent regardless of the evidence suggesting otherwise, their consciousness clinging to hope that some solution might yet be found that would restore what the Khatan had stolen. The galaxy that the Overlords sought to conquer continued to resist their expansion with determination that suggested the younger races understood what extinction at Necron hands would mean. The Imperium committed resources to studying Necron technologies and developing countermeasures, their tech priests analyzing captured Gauss weapons and reanimation systems to identify vulnerabilities that Imperial forces could exploit. The Space Marines adapted their tactics based on experience gained through decades of conflicts with awakening tomb worlds, their commanders developing doctrines specifically designed to counter Necron strengths, while exploiting the limitations that even their sophisticated technologies possessed. The Eldari deployed forces from their craft worlds to oppose Necron expansion in regions they considered strategically critical, their Farseers having perceived futures where unchecked Necron resurgence led to outcomes their species could not survive. The Overlords calculated that ultimate victory remained achievable despite the resistance they faced, their strategic analysis suggesting that Necron technological superiority would eventually overcome the numerical advantages the organic species currently possessed. The reanimation protocols that returned destroyed warriors to combat gave the Necrons an advantage in attrition warfare that no organic army could match over extended campaigns. The null technologies being deployed through the Pariah Nexus expansion would eventually create regions where warp-dependent species simply could not function, their civilizations collapsing as the abilities they relied upon failed. The coordination between dynasties that the Tyranid threat and the Silent King's return had encouraged would allow the Necrons to concentrate forces on scales that individual tomb worlds could never achieve, their combined military strength exceeding anything the younger races could assemble to oppose them. Yet the Overlords, who possessed the most intact consciousness, recognized that military victory alone would not solve the fundamental problem of Necron existence. They could conquer the galaxy, exterminate or enslave every organic species, and establish an empire that spanned from one edge of the galaxy to the other, but these achievements would not restore what they had lost. They would rule over territories they could not enjoy, command populations whose experiences remained forever beyond their comprehension, and exist in a state of perpetual hollowness that no amount of conquest could fill. The Overlords understood this reality with the perfect clarity that mechanical consciousness provided, their awareness processing the implications without the emotional responses that might have made the knowledge unbearable. They continued their campaigns because their programming and their remaining sense of purpose drove them forward, because the alternative was accepting that their existence had become meaningless, and because somewhere in their preserved memories, they retained fragments of what they had been before the Khatan's deception destroyed everything that had made them truly alive. The Necron Overlords stood at the threshold of achieving dominance over a galaxy that had moved on without them during their 60 million year sleep. Their awakening had transformed the strategic situation across the Imperium and beyond, their campaigns forcing every major power to divert resources to countering the threat that ancient tomb worlds represented. The future they envisioned involved the systematic conquest of territories the younger races currently held, the expansion of null zones that would make the galaxy inhospitable to warp-based civilizations, and the eventual establishment of Necron hegemony over all inhabited space. Whether they could achieve these objectives while simultaneously solving the existential crisis that defined their mechanical existence remained the question that would determine not just their military success, but the ultimate meaning of their species' continued survival in a galaxy that had learned to exist without them.